สวัสดีค่ะเอ่อ
Good morning, everyone.
ท่านนะคะ
Speakers, honorable guests, my name is Ayutthaya Siri Pathanakun, specialist in cultural heritage conservation from Southeast Asian Regional Center of Archaeology and Fine Arts under the aegis of Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization or SIMIOSPAFA. I'll be your MC for today. On behalf of the organizing agencies, Fine Arts Department, Unesco Bangkok, and SIMIOSPAFA, I'd like to welcome everyone to the seminar on promoting heritage impact assessment in Southeast Asia under the theme 3 Decades of Ayutthaya World Heritage, Values, Challenges, and Impact. So this seminar today will be held online via Zoom webinar for those people who have registered. Viewers can also view the seminar on Facebook Live in English on the Facebook page of SIMIOSPAFA and in Thai on Facebook page of Fine Arts Department, Ministry of Culture. Our seminar is held for 2 days on the 21st and 22nd of December from 9 o'clock to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. For today, we have 3 sessions. First, we have the opening and 2 keynote speakers. The second session is redefining Greater Ayutthaya, hearing from recent research and studies on Ayutthaya. And the third session is a panel discussion in discussing understanding the greater values and significance of historic city of Ayutthaya. So for the 2 days of the seminar, people who are joining the seminar, you can always submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box. And people who are viewing on Facebook Live, you can submit your questions and drop your questions in the comment box. We have our staff monitoring that and will send the question to us. And we will select random lucky winners to receive a gift from SIMIOSPAFA, one from webinar and one from Facebook. So without further ado, I'd like to now welcome you to the opening sessions promoting heritage impact assessment in Southeast Asia, 3 Decades of Ayutthaya World Heritage, Values, Challenges, and Impact. So we have 3 honorable speakers welcoming you from 3 organizations, starting with Fine Arts Department. I'd like to welcome Mr. Kittipan Pansawan, the Director General, please.
นางสมรักเจริญพจน์ผู้อำนวยการศูนย์ภูมิภาคโบราณ
Nang Somlak Jaranpot, Director of Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, Southeast Asian Regional Center of Archaeology and Fine Arts, Dongpikan from UNESCO Bangkok, Chief of Culture Unit, honorable speakers, representatives from various agencies and participants. I am very honored to be working with SIMIOSPAFA and UNESCO Bangkok on behalf of the Fine Arts Department to co-organize this webinar called Promoting Heritage Impact Assessment in Southeast Asia under the theme 3 Decades of Ayutthaya World Heritage Values, Challenges, and Impact. From archaeological evidence in history, it was found that Ayutthaya or Ayutthaya city has been established before the reign of King Tong in 1350. Towards the east of Basak River, it is called Ayutthaya city or Ayutthaya Siram Tepnagon. There were archaeological evidence such as Maheyong Temple, Wat Ayutthaya Temple. Before it has been relocated and expanded the city to Nong Sano Pond, which is situated between Basak River and Jalpaya River. There were also other evidence that shows the settlement towards the south of Ayutthaya Pukhou Dam, which is currently now the Puthai Sawan Temple. So the historical city of Ayutthaya should encompass the Ayutthaya towards the east and Pukhou Dam towards the south. It can be said that this World Heritage historic city of Ayutthaya is one of the most important cultural heritage of the country, and it has been the important port and commerce city in the Buddhist century 20th to 23rd. And there was so many civilizations and evidence in governance, law, justice, social system, religion, tradition, culture, architecture, sculpture, painting, fine arts, literature, language, and performance. All of these disciplines has been passed on from generations up until today. The Fine Arts Department is one of the main agencies to safeguard and conserve the historic city of Ayutthaya. Before 1976, this city has been registered as an archaeological site, which is called the Ayutthaya Island. There has been archaeological excavations, restoration, and conservation continuously being implemented to safeguard all the areas since 1997. And it has been registered as archaeological site, and there was the master plan was promulgated. So this historic city has been inscribed as World Heritage in 1991, and this year marks the 30th anniversary since the first inscription. So for the past 3 decades, this particular World Heritage have overcome a lot of challenges, whether overcoming the flood or the major flood, since Ayutthaya is situated in Chao Phraya Delta. That was in 2011. And Ayutthaya is one of the popular tourist destinations because it's situated not far from Bangkok. So there are so many projects, to try to address this flood and also to cater to the expansion of the city and a lot of construction for the basic infrastructure to enhance the quality of life of the people. So this particular seminar is a great occasion to hear from experts who are experts in Ayutthaya and in conservation and safeguarding this World Heritage. And it serves as a great platform for all agencies to come to discuss the management and, to oversee the integrative way of management. And also hearing about this heritage impact assessment for it to be used as a tool for the coexistence of conservation and development by preserving the values of this historic city of Ayutthaya. Lastly, I'd like to remind you of all the values, the great values of the historic city of Ayutthaya, which is our cultural heritage and also the world heritage, and encourage all the agencies to work together to preserve, conserve, and safeguard historic city of Ayutthaya sustainably. So I'd like to thank everyone who are here today, experts, honorable speakers, and all agencies, and I wish this seminar a great success. Thank you. Thank you very much, Director General. Next, I'd like to invite Dongpikan, Chief of Culture Unit from Unesco Bangkok, please.
Director General of the Fine Arts Department, Director of Simeo Spapa, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great pleasure to be here on behalf of the Director of UNESCO Bangkok today. Our seminar provides an opportunity to commemorate an important anniversary for the historic city of Ayutthaya. Ayutthaya is one of Thailand's first 2 World Heritage sites, along with Sukhothai and associated towns. Now, 30 years have passed, and in that time, Ayutthaya has regained its widespread prominence as one of the great cities in world history and a popular destination for visitors. At the same time, Ayutthaya has also seen many changes as well. Many people will still remember the floods of 2011 as one of the most serious challenges that the site has faced. Indeed, UNESCO worked closely with the Fine Arts Department at that time to respond to the emergency, resulting in recommendations for disaster risk mitigation, as well as long-term cooperation in strengthening restoration skills and standards. We are delighted that the Fine Arts Department has further expanded upon this collaboration and has initiated regular training and certification for conservation professionals and workers on an official basis. As you may know, UNESCO is celebrating another anniversary this year, which is the 10-year anniversary of the Historic Urban Landscape Recommendation. This recommendation has widened our view and approach about managing historic sites to ensure that we connect the restoration of ancient monuments with the environmental setting and the social context. This is particularly important at Ayutthaya, which continues to be part of a living community with an important economic role. To provide holistic management for the site, we should take into account all these different dimensions of the site, which will provide enhanced protection of the key World Heritage components while ensuring greater sustainability as well. In this light, it is notable that Thailand has indicated its intention to consider the possible expansion of the World Heritage property to more comprehensively protect the footprint of the historic city of Ayutthaya beyond the boundary of the current World Heritage Site and to respond to various challenges that the site is facing. I hope that this seminar will provide an opportunity to bring together the leading experts and the key organizations working on Ayutthaya in order to move us forward in a harmonious and productive manner. I wish this seminar every success. Thank you.
Thank you very much คุณฮันขอบคุณค่ะคุณฮันลำดับถัดไปนะคะสุดท้ายแต่ไม่ท้ายสุดค่ะ
Last but not least, I'd like to welcome the Director of Southeast Asian Regional Center of Archaeology and Fine Arts from Simeo Spafa, Tan Somlak Charanpot, to welcome everyone. So, Director General from Fine Arts Department, Dr. Dongpikan, Chief of Culture Unit from Unesco Bangkok, esteemed guests, speakers, and representatives and participants. I am very honored that the Simeo Spafa has this opportunity to co-host this particular seminar to promote heritage impact assessment in Southeast Asia under the theme 3 Decades of Ayutthaya World Heritage, Values, Challenges, and Impact. Together with Fine Arts Department and UNESCO Bangkok from the 21st and 22nd of December. So in the past years, we often hear that these cultural heritage in Southeast Asia have had impact from natural disasters, many of them actually. For example, the historic city of Ayutthaya was greatly impacted by the Great Flood in 2011, or in Bagan, Myanmar. There was a lot of damage from earthquake in 2016. Moreover, there are many sites and ancient churches that were destroyed by Yolanda's typhoon. So aside from these natural disasters, there are other threats as well that exist in many countries in Southeast Asia as well as Thailand. That is the countries that are cities development and construction of infrastructures to promote transportation and logistics in response to urban development and economic growth. All these development projects many times cause great impact to the values of these cultural heritage. For these reasons, agencies that is responsible for conserving, safeguarding these heritage would have to conduct heritage impact assessment, whether in the historic city of Ayutthaya, Pukhou, or Luang Prabang, as well as in Turmoil, just to give a few examples. SPAFA A few of our missions are to promote human capital development in archaeology and fine arts, as well as conservation, safeguarding of cultural heritage in Southeast Asia, that is in our region. So we see the significance of for us to enhance the capabilities of these personnel who are responsible for these conservation and safeguarding, for them to be equipped with knowledge to be able to conduct this impact assessment efficiently, effectively. Because this knowledge is actually new to our region, therefore we see the significance that we need to enhance the knowledge in our personnel. So we have incorporated this curriculum to our 5-year development plan of SPAFA, which will actually begin next year. So in order to prepare and consolidate all this information to develop the curriculum, SPAFA work closely with Fine Arts Department and Unesco Bangkok and initiated a project to raise awareness on heritage impact assessment, first of its kind in Southeast Asia, by focusing on the challenges that the historic city of Ayutthaya is experiencing as a model. So we can learn from this. So by realizing the impact assessment, not in just Thailand, but this will actually benefit the whole region. The reason that we pick the historic city of Ayutthaya is to commemorate the 30th anniversary that Ayutthaya has been inscribed as World Heritage. So this seminar is held online for the period of 2 days. And we wanted all the agencies to be able to revisit these outstanding universal values of the historic city of Ayutthaya that has great values in terms of culture and disciplines. And Ayutthaya was one of the center of the trade hub and the center of diplomacy in the region from the 14th to the 18th century. So if we gain a thorough understanding of these values, of the cultural heritage, this would actually lead to efficient impact assessment. And it could be a great example to other sites as well. So this seminar, we are very fortunate that we are joined by many esteemed experts from Thailand and abroad. So on behalf of the organizing agencies, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude and thanks to all the experts and speakers, as well as representatives from all agencies for joining. And thank you, the working group from Fine Arts Department and UNESCO Bangkok, for coming together to be behind the organization of this particular seminar. And most importantly, I'd like to thank all the participants who have joined us today and showing interest and becoming the audience of this seminar. And I do hope this seminar should more or less be beneficial to you. So now I'd like to take this opportunity to officially open this seminar on promoting heritage impact assessment in Southeast Asia under the theme of 3 decades of Ayutthaya World Heritage, Values, Challenges, and Impact. And I do wish this seminar a great success, and we meet the objectives that we have set out. Thank you very much.
ขอบพระคุณท่านผู้อำนวยการค่ะ
Thank you very much, Director. Our seminar wouldn't have been a success if we did not have support from you. So I think this concludes the opening ceremony. Next, I'd like to invite you to the keynote sessions. We have two keynote speakers with us today. First, we have a keynote on cultural landscape of Chao Phraya Delta from Ayutthaya Sri Ram Thep Nakhon to Ayutthaya Ratchathani by Adjunct Professor Sisak Walipodom or Professor Sisak. He wasn't able to join us, but we have a recording of his keynote. Please. Criteria for civilization is first there needs to be urban development, roads, city planning that will constitute cities. Second, there should be technology advancement, tools that can be used, like iron and bronze that has developed into tools. Third is literacy, by which I mean communities that has writings. We understand that writings originate in Sukhothai era, which is not true, because in Chao Phraya Delta, the port city is situated in Kumtawa. Then there was geographical change. Like in Ratburi had Kubur as an important port city. So even more boats or ships docked there than Nakhon Pathom. But Kubur had to change because Kubur River became shallow, so they moved 5 kilometers to the current Ratchaburi city right now. Then there was also port cities that happened in Phetburi, Nakhon Si, Thammarat, but that moved in many locations. So there were clusters that were built. So Ayutthaya and Ratburi, Suphanburi developed in the same era. So those were the cities that existed. I studied Ayutthaya and wrote about the history of Ayutthaya because I wanted to argue that Sukhothai was the only important city, and I wanted to argue that King Tong was not from there. So my father knew and learned about the evidence of the ancient city towards the east of Ayutthaya, which was mentioned by จ้าคุณโบราณ, Prince Damrong, and King Rama V. But we followed the history written by France, which identified that the city originated from Khmer, which was not true. It was a misunderstanding in history. So I argue and contest that. So I wrote about Ayutthaya. And this name was used alternatively with Ayutthaya, but I followed the oldest inscription that mentioned Ayutthaya, which is Khao Kop Jaruk, mentioned in the King Tesi Sattharat, and mentioned the Ayutthaya Sri Ram Thep Nakhon. And I thought at that period there was no establishment of Ayutthaya. However, Ayutthaya existed here. I checked from the evidence from Pukhou moat, which is an ancient moat, but everyone thought that was dug as Ayutthaya's moat. However, that moat was built or dug. If you look at this river, this river is the Basak River.
มันมาจากทาง
Basak
สระบุรี
River
จากทาง
was
แก่งคอย
flowing from
พอมาถึง
Saraburi,
มาถึง
Chiang
สระบุรีมาถึง
Kai.
พระแก้วนะฮะ
Then when it
มันแยกเป็น
reaches
สอง
Phra
ทาง
Kaew,
ซ้ายหนึ่ง
it
ตัดลง
splits
ไปที่
into
อุทัย
two.
อำเภออุทัย
One way goes to Uthai district,
แล้วก็ผ่านอุทัยอำเภออุทัยนะ
going through
ผ่านการเป็นคลอง
Uthai,
โพไปออกที่
then exits as
Bangla
Klong Po Canal in
Side
Bang Pa In. So that's the first waterway. The second waterway,
สระบุรีเนี่ย
once it enters
ที่ผ่านนครหลวงเนี่ย
Saraburi
นี่เป็นสายที่
through
สอง
Nakhon
สายที่สองเนี่ย
Luang, that's the second waterway I'm talking about. And it comes close to Ayutthaya. It goes around as Hantra
อ่าเวลา
River.
เขาสร้าง
And
อยุธยา
this
ตรงนี้
is where they
อยุธยา
built
เนี่ยเขาขุด
Ayutthaya.
คลอง
So
ลำน้ำเนี่ย
canals
นะตักขึ้นมา
were
เพื่อ
dug
จะดึงน้ำเนี่ยให้ลงมา
in order to pull the
ลำน้ำเจ้าพระ
water
ยาเนี่ยนะฮะ
towards
แล้ว
Chao Phraya
จริง
River,
ๆไอ้
and
คู
that
คือหน้า
was
ที่
where Ayutthaya was established. So the Pukhou now moat
ของอยุธยา
is the moat that existed in the west of Ayutthaya. Towards the east of Ayutthaya, communities were relying on Handra River.
เส้นนั้นมันจะมันอ้อม
So that waterway actually
แล้วจะขุด
goes
คูซับ
around,
ซ้อนออกไปทีแต่
and
ว่า
there were bypass moats that were dug here in Temple, Mahayong Temple, and the city plan was rectangular, similar to Ratchaburi and
เนี่ย
Suphanburi.
ถ้าคุณเห็นตรงเนี้ยนะฮะเห็นไหม
And if you look
ลำหันตรา
here,
มานี่
so Handra River goes from here, and this is the natural waterway that goes around and exits here. So when they built Ayutthaya, they dug moats straight here. So this is the city moat.
มันมีการสร้างไอ้
Then there was a construction of city walls inside. So the east of Ayutthaya extends until here, and further out to areas of Mahayong Temple.
แล้วก็ดูจากหลักฐานพวกรูปแบบ
If you look at the evidence of ancient architecture, it's the same as what appears in Suphanburi. It's older, whether as appears in Wat Yai Chai Mongkon
วัด
Temple,
มเหยงวัดสมณโก
Mahayong Temple, Sumanakot Temple, Ayutthaya Temple, Gudi Dao Temple. All are ancient temples, same architecture. That's the city temples. And the outer rim is Mahayong Temple and Chang Temple. Wat Mahayong has its significance because here it is understood that was mentioned in the Sukhothai inscription
พระสงฆ์ที่พระสมณเถระพระสมณเถระที่ไม่สมณเถระ
there were monks from
ที่เป็น
Sukhothai
พระสุโขทัย
that
เนี่ย
came
เรียนที่อยุธยา
to study in Ayutthaya and brought back Buddhism to Sukhothai.
อันเนี้ยเพราะฉะนั้นที่ส่งไปเรียนลังกานี่มีตั้งหลายกลุ่ม
So there were so many monks sent to Lanka to study from Lawo, from Ayutthaya, and Nakhon Si Thammarat. That's about Lanka Wong. Those are ancient evidence that existed. But here is Wat Yai Chai Mongkon Temple. So evidence found around the palace is square right here.
มันกระเดียดตรงนี้
The station is a little bit
ที่หลัก
towards
ฐานนี่เราได้
closer towards
ที่
here.
มันมีคันกระแพงมันก็เหมือน
So there's actually soil embankment similar to Suvarnabhumi. It's not the city wall. That's the ancient
เป็น
form.
แบรนด์ซิตี้เลย
This is actually the city plan that exists, and it's long in rectangular shape.
เขาจะอาศัยลำน้ำ
However, the area will rely on waterways to
มันไม่ได้ชัด
expand.
เจนว่ามันขยายแต่ไอ้ที่
So
ชัดเจน
moats, doesn't show clear expansion, but what is clear is here.
ระยะแรกเนี่ยพ่อผมบอกว่า
We understand, as told by my father, the palace existed in the north, then it moved here,
แล้วก็จุดที่สำคัญ
reading
ที่
from
ตรง
the
วัดพระ
legends.
เชิญท ที่วัดพนัญเชิงนี่
And
เป็นท่า
the
เรือจอด
important location is
เพราะนั่นเรือ
Panancheng
ที่
Temple.
ต่างประเทศ
That's
ที่ขึ้น
where
มามันจะ
boats
ทอดหัว
docked.
ตรงนี้
The foreign
แล้วมันมีไอ้พว
ships
ก
and boats
ซากสม
would
เต็ม
anchor
เลย
here.
นะ
So
แล้
we
วก็
found a lot of
ใน
anchorage
องค์เทว
evidence.
ดาหลวงประเสริฐก็พูดว่า
Many of
วัด
them
พระเจ้าพนัญ
and
เชิงเนี่ยสร้าง
Luang
เป็น
Prasert
อย่าง
Chronicle
20 ปี
also
เมื่อสร้าง
mentioned
ก่อนในยา
that
20
Panancheng
ปี
Temple
แสดง
was
ว่า
built
เมืองนี้
26
มันก็
years before
มันเป็นเมืองขอม
Ayutthaya.
เป็นเมืองขนาด
Definitely shows that
ใช่ไหม
this is not a
ซึ่งนับถือ
Khmer
พุทธร่วม
city.
สมัยกับสุโขทัย
So it's a
ซึ่ง
big
สุวรรณภู
city
มิซึ่งมีพระใหญ่
that holds
ที่เป็น
Buddhism as
อยู่
a
ใน
main
มณฑป
religion in the
อัน
same
นี้เป็นร่วม
era
สมั
as
ยกัน
Sukhothai and
มัน
Suvarnabhumi
คือมันก็เก่า
with large
มันก็เจริญมาเก่าเนี่ยแล้วมันมา
Buddha
ตอนหลังก็มีการย้าย
and
มาอยู่
had
ที่
its
นี่
civilization.
ในสมัย
Then it
ไม่ใช่
relocated
อู่ทองก็คง
here.
อยู่ที่นี่นะฮะ
King
คงอยู่
Wutong
ในบริ
would
เวณ
have
นี้
probably been
นะฮะ
here yeah,
ไม่
around
ใช่อู่ทองอยู่ในบริเวณย้ายจากบริเวณเนี้ยเข้ามาแถวหนองสโหนนี่ก่อน เพราะมันมีพูดถึงเรื่อง
Nong Sano
จด
Pond
หมายพูด
or
ถึง
Nong Sano Lake.
มี
That
เจ้าแก้ว
because
เจ้าไทย
this
ที่
was
ที่
mentioned
เกิด
in
ที่ว่า
the
ไทยโลก
Chronicle
ตาย
about Zhao
ใช่ไหม
Gao, Zhao Thai
แล้วก็
that died of a
ก็
cholera
อาจจะเป็น
outbreak.
เรื่องเส้นทางการค้านะคือ
And
มัน
that
มัน
is
อาจจะ
also
เล็กลงไปเนี่ย
relevant
นะ
with
เพราะฉะนั้น
the
ก็
commerce
ไอ้
ways areas.
เวลาย้ายมาเนี่ยเขาย้าย
So
มา
when
ฝั่ง
there
นี้
was
ก่อน
a resettlement, they moved
เนี่ย
here
ตรงเนี้ยเวียง
first,
เล็กเวียง
here
เล็ก
in
นะ
Wiang
ฮะ
Lek.
แต่ก่อนหน้านะตรงนี้เป็นชุมชนใหญ่ที่
But
ปะทะ
before
คุณจาม
that, it was a big
ทั้งสองฝั่ง
community
เนี่ยมัน
called Pataku
เรือ
Jam.
ต่างประ
On
เทศ
the
มันเข้า
two
มาตรงนี้
sides, this is where,
ทีนี้
foreign
เว
vessels
ลาย้ายเนี่ย
docked.
นะฮะ
So when they relocated,
ก็ต้องดูตรงนี้เป็นหลัก
the main
มันมีหนองสโหน
consideration
มัน
was
ต้องมีเล
here.
ก
There was
เพื่อว่า
Nong Sono
มัน
Lake
ต้องมีน้ำอ่ะ
because they needed water, right? So without
ใช่ไหม
water,
ต้องมีน้ำ
there would be
น้ำกิน
no
เพราะฉะนั้น
life.
ต้องเอานี่เป็นตัวหลักแล้วบริเวณ
So
เนี้ย
they
ถ้า
took
ถ้าดูนะ
this
ถ้าดู
as the
แผนที่
main
เนี่ย
factor.
พื้นที่
If
เนี่ย
you
เป็น
look at this
catchment
map,
เป็นที่น้ำ
the whole
น้ำ
area is a catchment
น้
area.
น้ำที่มาจากตรงเนี้ยมันจะเทลง
All the water flowing would go
การขุด
towards here.
ลำน้ำลพบุรีนี่ครู
So the digging of
Good
all
here.
this canals
Vietnam,
and
Himalaya,
moats,
Thailand,
this
Cambodia.
is actually
Hindi lang kaya
to
yung laman
direct and divert water here and
Ang tuwa mo,
expand
wala
it into big
Hindi
waterways. And cities,
May-
communities
may-
are
may-
built along the canals.
Yeah, man.
It
Man-
wasn't
man-
big
man- man-
communities.
เปลี่ยนกรุงเทพธนบุรี
Very similar
Yeah,
to
man-
Bangkok
man-
and
man-
Thonburi. So it
Yeah,
begins
แล้วก็
small
การค้ามันอาจจะ
and then it
เพราะตอนนั้น
expanded.
เพราะว่าไอ้เนี่ย
Because of
มันเบส
trade.
เอาลำน้ำป่าสักนั่นเอง
So
ย้ายมาจบตรงนี้ปั๊บเนี่ย
Ayutthaya
คือแม่น้ำ
based
เจ้าพระยาแม่น้ำน้อย
the expansion
แม่น้ำลพบุ
on
รีแม่น้ำน้อย
Basak
ซึ่ง
River. If they
ก็
move,
ทำให้
they would get
ไอ้ทุก
water
อย่าง
from
เนี่ย
Chao Phraya River,
ที่
Nam
ทุกอย่าง
Noi River,
ทุกลำน้ำ
Lopburi
ขึ้นเขา
River.
วิทยา
So
มันมีร่องรอย
all
การขุด
waterways
คลอง
go
กว่าเชื่อมโยง
flows
เนี่ย
towards
บริเวณนี้
Ayutthaya.
เต็มไปด้วยเกาะ
You can see the connecting canals and bypass
แล้ว
canals
ยุคแรก
around
ยุคหลัง
the
เนี่ยดู
island.
แผนที่ฝรั่งเลยเต็มเลยว่าแถว
And if you you see a lot of this in the foreign maps. So
แล้วสมัยว่า
in the beginning of Ayutthaya and during the Utong King reign, the settlement was developed around Nong Sono Lake, but most people still lived in Ayutthaya.
มันมาตามคลองโพแล้วไปตัดเข้า
The settlement was through Khong Pro and then Khong Pro Canal and then going through Bang Pe In. So that area became a hub. So if you wanted to go to Ayutthaya, to Lopburi, you have to go through Bang Pe In, Kok Pra, then Khong Pro and go around. But toward the north, it was much later in Ayutthaya. So basically, it's comparative to Bangkok and Thonburi, and the evidence was clear. But we didn't think about that because we learned history by memorizing. But it's important to learn history with critical thinking. Don't believe what I say because I'm biased in my own thinking, right? So that's why we understand it like this, and we don't see our own civilization. People did not understand the Ratana Kosin Island, architect, lakes.
If
If you look at the maps in King Rama IV, only small portion of population lived in Bangkok. There was a lot of rice field, plantations, temples. More people lived along the canals. And there was a big change after King Rama IV. People only lived around the city. In the archive, the French archive mentioned that during the King Narais, Ayutthaya had 150,000 population. That's even bigger than London. And it was too much to situate it into the middle of Ayutthaya. But actually, people lived along the canals because around Ayutthaya, there's about like 40,000 rafts. You know, people were living in blocks of canals. And they were living around the area like Nakhon Luang and Bang Pai In. So this is just showing you the cultural landscape, you know, coupling with the evidence of culture and arts. And it has a beautiful city plan, right? You can see canals being dug and how the city expanded. So in Ayutthaya, all rivers lead to Ayutthaya because of the connecting canals. So Ayutthaya represents, you know, the waterways connection. But once it reaches Ayutthaya, all the canals leads to Bangkok, right? Or Nam Noi River, because it's a young delta. So in the east, there is Basak River, then Chao Phraya River, then Lopburi River, then Menam Noi River. But the main waterways for Ayutthaya is Basak River, Lopburi, Chao Phraya, then Menam Noi. Menam Noi is actually was dug many times, and you can see that, you know, there was a lot of flood in this area. So there was a lot of water management going on. So people studying Ayutthaya always mentions or studies the waterways. So if you look at the city plan, Ayutthaya has the city canals, not the city moats. City canals means it can be, you know, boats and can travel. The city that has, you know, city canals are the examples are Nakhon Pathom, Nakhon Chai-si, Ratburi, not Phetburi, Suphanburi, yes, and then Ayutthaya. Nakhon Pathom is actually the first city, then Ayutthaya, then Ayutthaya to Bangkok. Then just Ayutthaya itself, the construction of city wall is just not solely for the purpose of defense, but it protects water and floods. Bangkok as well. That's why Ayutthaya has water gates that can open and close. If you can see the big picture, and if you look at the annex developed by Japan or Western map, you can see that there are evidence of walls like Bangkok, like in Mahakan Fort. So that's similar to what how Ayutthaya is constructed. So that's where boats dock and where houses are built. Houses are constructed along the canals. So the foreign map did not appear clearly because it wasn't a clean area. So it's important to understand the landscape. Like in Bangkok, what is left is the Prapang Wat Pang Luang and Prapang Wat Rakhang Temple. So that's the waterways, right? So there's a lot of complexity behind these canals that becomes network. So people don't understand the cultural landscape. They only study art. You know, in Kok Mueang or Ayutthaya Island, there was government, temples, schools, and markets. But not everyone lived in the city. They lived
คุณ
in
ไม่
the
ได้
outer
เดิน
rims,
นะฮะมันก็เหมือนกรุ
then
งเทพ
there was
อะ
clear
น้ำ
city
ไม่สวย
planning,
น้ำไม่สวย
similar,
อย่าง
very similar
ก็
to
เหมือนกับธนบุรี
Bangkok.
อะน้ำหลายสาย
Waterways
ตัว
in
มัน
Ayutthaya is
ตัว
similar
อยุธ
to
ยานี่เดียว
Thonburi.
มันอยู่เซ
So
น
many
นะ
waterways.
มันเป็นสวนมาก่อน
Ayutthaya was very centered
เขา
in
ไม่
the
เขาไม่
middle.
ดูนี่คือต้องเล่นแลนด์สเคป
It's
แต่งาน
important
โบราณคดี
to
เฉ
look
พาะ
at
ขุ
the
ดรถ
landscape.
ทรายคุณบูรณาการมาก
But
นะ
you know, in
ตึกเนี่ย
archaeology,
ขุด
you
6
would
คูณ
focus
6
on
ถ้าคุณบอก
excavation,
โลกทั้งโลก
you
มัน
know,
คือขุด
6
อะ
by 6 area.
คือมันไม่
But the
มัน
world
ไม่เห็
is
น
not just
เราเห็น
there
ทั้งประวั
in
ติศาสตร์วัฒน
that
ธรรมและประวัติศาสตร์สังคม
grid. You
ไอ้
know,
การ
you
ที่เอา
have
ไอ้
to
พว
look
ก
at the culture and
ตำ
social
นงตำนาน
history
ไอ้พวก
of areas as well.
หลักฐานเกี่ยว
You
กับ
have
ประ
to
เทศเนี่ย
study
เราเห็นคนอะ
the evidence,
เห็นคนที่
geographical
ใหญ่อยู่คือเขาต้อง
evidence,
ดูหลั
and
กฐาน
how people
เก่า
lived.
เป็นยังไงแล้วก็ดูปัจจุบันเป็นยังไง
Then,
ว่ามันมีร่
if
อง
you
รอย
look at
เก่า
those
ยังไงแล้วมันเปลี่ยน
history
แปลงยังไงเพราะมันมี
evidence,
คนใหม่เข้า
if
มา
you look how the
และ
city has
เพลสใหม่
developed,
ๆจะเกิดขึ้นเนี่ยมันต้องศึกษา
so
อย่าง
there were new
เขาไม่ศึก
places
ษา
that
แลนด์สเคป
emerge.
ตรงนี้
So it's
ไอ้ตัวแลนด์ส
important
เค
to
ปเนี่ยเป็นประวัติ
understand
ศาสต
the
ร์สังคม
landscape. It's
วัด
actually
เนี่ย
a
ใครส
social
ร้างเป็น
history.
ของใครยังอยู่เนี่ย
Like
แต่
who
คุณจะ
built
ว่า
that
วัดนี้มี
temple,
ศิลปะอย่างนั้นตายจบเพราะเป็
like
นศูน
and
ย์กลาง
what
ชุมชน
kind.
เนี่ย
You don't study only the arts. You
แล้ว
know,
ไหน
a
ไหนเป็น
temple
วัดหล
was
วงวัดล่าง
was the center of community. Also,
ใช่ไหม
different types of
เพราะว่า
temples
วัดหลวง
mattered.
เนี่ย
If
เขา
it's
จะ
a
เขา
city
จะมีอุป
temple,
ถัมภ์
if
แต่เขา
it's
ก็รับจำบรรดาคนอะ
the people's
เท่าไหร่
temple.
กี่คนกี่ครัวกี่ครัว
So
บาง
the
ทีก็
royal
พวก
temple
เจ้า
was
นายขุนนางก็
sponsored
ตาม
by the king,
ในอยุธ
right?
ยาเนี่ยไอ้คลังสมบัติเนี่ยมันไม่อยู่
And
ที่ธนาคารมันอยู่ที่
temples is placed there, and people lived around the temple.
การสร้างวัดสร้าง
All the
การ
treasures
สร้างวัด
existed
เนี่ยนะ
there.
คือการสร้างชุมชนเพราะเมื่อสร้างวัด
So building a
คุณต้อง
temple means, you know, building
คนที่ดิน
communities.
และ
So
ให้
when you
คน
build a
ดูแล
temple,
สิ่ง
you
ศักดิ์สิทธิ์ตรงนั้นก็
establish
กลายเป็นคนที่เขา
people
ไม่
who
กี่
will
ครัว
take
กี่
care
ต่าง
of the community.
เพราะฉะนั้นการกัลบนา
And
เนี่
you
ย
can
หมายถึง
control
กา
how
ร
many
สร้างชุมชน
households
โดย
you
ตรงแต่
have.
ว่ามันเรา
So
ไม่บอกว่า
it's
มันเป็นการ
community
เอามา
building.
ใช้ทั้งเขต
But people interpret
Ang
it
Thong
in
เนี่ย
different way. You
พวก
know,
ลาวที่เขา
in
เกณฑ์
for
อยู่
example,
เนี่ย
in
เขาจะ
Ang
มาเป็น
Thong,
ขี้
like
ข้า
Laos,
เขา
who
ตั้งให้
were
ตั้ง
came
ถิ่น
to
ฐาน
work,
แล้ว
they
เขาเกณฑ์
weren't
ให้มาขุดคล
slave.
อง
You
อะ
know, they
เขาขุดคลอ
were
งไปแล้ว
came
เขา
to,
ก็ใช้
they
อะ
were brought
เอาได้
in
ใช้
to
นี่วัดโพโน่นโพ
make
นี่
settlement.
ข่าวนั้นน่ะ
You know, and they took
ใช่ไหม
part in, you
เพราะ
know,
ฉะนั้นไม่ต้องไป
digging
ดู
canals. Yes.
พระเจ้าดินเขาไม่ได้มีหน้าที่
So,
ที่จะเอา
and
มาเป็น
back in the day,
มัน
the
เป็นมอง
king
ภาพมันเหมือนยุโรปอะ
did not, you
คือ
know,
ไปมองภาพที่ฝรั่ง
bring people
แต่ง
for
เขมรขึ้น
slavery
มา
because we did
จริง
not
ๆไม่ใช่
build
พระเจ้าแผ่น
cities
ดินคือ
like
ผู้
in
ที่
the Western
อุป
ways,
ถัมภ์ศาสนา
like in
สร้างวัด
the
คุณซื้อที่
Khmer
ดิน
sense,
ของก็เหมือนกั
you
น
know, but the king
ที่
was
ดิน
actually
แล้วก
the
รุณา
main patronage that
คน
supported
กี่
religion,
คนกี่
built
ครัวเรือน
temples,
พวกเนี้ย
and
เข้าใจไหม
built
แล้วเขาก็ดูแลนั้น
communities.
ใช้สิ่งศักดิ์สิทธิ์
And
เป็นศูนย์ก
people
ลาง
built
มันก็
communities,
เติบโต
you
ออก
know,
ลูกออกหลานก็
having
แผ่เข้าไป
temples as
บ้าน
center,
เมืองมันเกิด
and
ขึ้นอย่างนั้นมาก
communities
ก
would
ว่า
expand.
ค่ะขอบคุณอาจารย์
Thank you,
ศิษะมาก
Professor
นะคะที่
Sisak.
ได้จริงๆเทปที่เราไปบันทึก
So the recording that we made with Professor Sisak was very long, so we edited all the parts that was about the establishment of Ayutthaya. So if opportunity permits, we will have the whole version of the recording, and we'll post that on the SPASA Facebook page of SPAFA. So he talked about the development of Ayutthaya before the city became the city Ayutthaya in Buddhist era 1893. So you can see the long development from there. Next, we have the next speaker, Chris Baker. So Chris Baker is actually in academia, who actually wrote the author of 5 Centuries of Ayutthaya. There are 2 versions in English and Thai. So this year he released the Thai version. In the beginning of the year, he co-wrote that with Professor Pasuk Pongpaitit, and he is also the editor of Siam Samakom that publishes, you know, new studies of Ayutthaya. So we are honored to have him here with us to give us the picture of the development of Ayutthaya through 5 centuries. Please, Ajahn Chris Baker.
สวัสดีทุกคนขอบคุณซีเนียลสปาฟ้า
Good morning, everyone. First, thank you, Simeo Spafa, UNESCO Bangkok and Fine Arts Department for organizing such important seminar and for extending this invitation to me. It's such an honor. When Westerners came to Siam 500 years ago, they reported that it was a major center of Asia. How de Barros, a Portuguese, called Siam one of three principal kingdoms of the East, alongside China and South India. In Europe, a Dutchman wrote that Siam surpassed any place in the Indies except for China in terms of population, elephants, gold, gemstones, shipping, commerce, trade, and fertility. So Europeans were impressed by three things. First is the wealth and prosperity of Ayutthaya, as seen by the opulence of its palaces and temples and splendor of royal ceremonies. Secondly, they reckoned that the size of the city was on par with London, Paris, the great cities of that age. Third, they were impressed by the abundance and fertility. For example, Jeremias van Vliet wrote that Siam is a country that has more than most other countries of everything that the human being needs. And the diplomat Simon de la Loubert commented jokingly that with rice, fish, and liquor so plentiful and cheap, it is no wonder if in the evening there is heard nothing but singing in their houses. So Ayutthaya is very remarkable because it's a major city for almost 500 years, 80 years before it was officially founded according to the Chronicles, as mentioned by Professor Sisak earlier. In Asia, only Beijing and Kyoto that could rival with this record. Most other centers came up in the colonial era, such as Jakarta, Saigon, Singapore, and Tokyo. We often talk about Ayutthaya era, which gives the impression that it was constant throughout. Rather, there were several Ayutthaya eras divided in 500 years in four periods based on social change, not dynasty. The first period is called Rising from the Sea. It is a dark age because we have very little information. Before, it was hard to see how Ayutthaya rose from the sea of mud, but Chinese record shows, and it makes it clearer that Ayutthaya became the major trading partner of China for 150 years by arranging supply of forest goods, especially fragrant timbers, and by handling diplomacy with China very skillfully. The society of Ayutthaya, in the early days, was much simpler than it has become. Ma Huan, the scribe of the Tsinghu voyage, recorded that the customs of the people are noisy and playful. They like to practice fighting on water. It was like upcoming ports everywhere all through time. Ma Huan also recorded that the house in which the king resides is rather elegant, neat, and clean. When going about mounting the elephant while the man holds a gold-handled umbrella, he lives in a house, not a palace. He travels with one elephant, one attendant, one umbrella. This is much simpler than the later times. He also wrote that it is their affairs and their customs that everything is managed by their wives, both the king and the countrymen and common people. It shows the mental capacity of wives certainly exceeded of the men. So Ayutthaya was not just commercial society, not an agrarian or peasant society, because the men became dominant because of their physical strength. The second period is the age of warfare, which began about in the 1430, when Ayutthaya sent out armies in all directions to Tawai, to Chiang Mai and Angkor, far greater distance than earlier battles. Over the next 170 years, there were war or battles every other year. So the armies were massive, and the era became militarized society. The prize system existed earlier, but now expanded even more. Success in war became the route to social advancement, both for nobles and ordinary people. Big annual festivals in Ayutthaya was military parades displaying all fights, fighting disciplines, and the military epic poem Lilith Yuan Pai gave a sense of the ethos of this society. For general people, ordinary people, this era was a terrible time. Many people died in warfares, both on the battlefields and from being exposed to fevers from the forests. Epidemics and famines increased, probably the population decreased. Eventually, people resisted. They fled into the forest, hid in robes as monks, and bribed the recruiters from being conscripted. So the size of armies shrank. The campaigns failed, and eventually the generals gave up because the war was no longer gave any benefits. Then in the 1600s, the fighting stopped, and the third age of peace and commerce began. The resources of Ayutthaya society, whether it's human resources, were transformed from war to commerce and livelihood. More Europeans arrived in Southeast Asia, Dutch, French, and British, but Ayutthaya prospered as an entrepot between the rich Asian empires to east and west. Ayutthaya became known as City of 40 Nations. It often seems that important foreigners were Westerners, but that's only because many French and Dutch wrote books about Ayutthaya. But in fact, the important foreign trading partners and foreign residents were Asian, noble administrators from Persia, Brahmins traders, soldiers from India, soldiers and adventurers from Japan, traders and sailors from China. The fourth period is riches in turmoil. Before, it was thought that Ayutthaya declined from 1688 down to the fall to Burma in 1767, but not anymore. In this era, Ayutthaya prospered than ever before, largely due to trade with China. This prosperity also spread widely in the society. The nobles became richer. There were new groups. Prai Mang Mi, or rich serfs, appeared on the records. It is time for social ferment, more revolts, more crime, as people looked for shortcuts to prosperity, more corruption, including buying of positions. People used new wealth to overturn the old social barriers. As often happens, the combination of wealth and social change stimulated cultural production, especially in paintings, literature, drama, and architecture. And in these cultural products, we can see a new concept of human beings' place in the universe and social order. Across the 500 years, the physical city changed many times. The earliest settlement may have been to the east of the island, as mentioned by Professor Sisa. Then, in the age of peace and commerce, there was a lot of markets to the southeast of the island and expanded along the waterways in all directions, not just to the south. Some parts, however, still remained rustic. You can see that a lot of canals were dug, suggesting that there was a population increase. In the last 20-30 years, our understanding of Ayutthaya has improved enormously because of new sources and information. So in Ming Chinese records that was translated into English by Jeff Wade, into Thai by Vinay Pongsipian, makes the first period of rising from the sea much less dark than before. The Chronicle fragment filed by Michael Vickery and Ubonsi Attapan has information on the age of warfare, which was found nowhere else. For the age of peace and commerce, hidden treasures have emerged from European archives, including scrolls from King Petracha's cremation, and from Thai archives, the eulogy of King Prasad Tong. So there was also a record of understanding better through the warfare than battles with Myanmar. So surface archaeology has resulted in fascinating studies of rolls of ceramics. But there has been relatively little digging below the surface, and almost none outside the historical centers. So there has been changes in the last few years. New generation of archaeologists are producing fascinating works. Other than the archaeology being utterly transformed by technology, such as DNA analysis and LiDAR scanning. And a great example is the Angkor Wat, and that revolutionized history. Ayutthaya underground has enormous untapped potential. And there is a demand now for Ayutthaya's history. It's often said that Thais are not interested in history, and young people only read from screen, which is not true. Some of the new generations are really fascinated with history, especially history that goes beyond the mainstream version. So when we launched a history of Ayutthaya at the book fair last year, we noticed that almost none in the queue were signatures were over 25. When we asked and talked to them, most of them were high school students. To conclude, Ayutthaya has long cultural treasures and of global significance. The city was a major factor in Asian history. And that is just the beginning to be written for the Asian century. Our understanding of this history has improved enormously in recent years. But there is great unused, untapped potential, particularly those that exist underground. Like other historical sites, Ayutthaya is fragile. Once destroyed, it's gone forever. Ayutthaya is like that too. So it is the responsibility of people now to protect, preserve, safeguard Ayutthaya and its history for the world, for future generations, and for the future. Thank you.
เราได้รับภาพลับๆรับรู้เรื่องราวของอยุธยา
Thank you very much, Professor Chris.
ที่ประมาณสัก20 นาทีได้อย่าง
So we have learned about Ayutthaya in the period of 5 centuries in 20 minutes and seeing the chronological order of development from the past to the present and also learn what is going on in the studies of Ayutthaya right now in academic realm, which will be very useful for people who are studying Ayutthaya at the moment. Thank you very much. And if we have more opportunity in the future, I'd like to invite you again for more lectures. Thank you very much. So that concludes the first session from the keynotes by Ajahn Chris Baker. So if you have any questions, please drop your questions in the Q&A box and the chat box as well. We will collect questions from there and we'll randomly pick people who post the questions to receive the gift from SPAFA, and our staff will contact you later. So in the second session of our seminar, the theme is redefining Greater Ayutthaya. Some of the information are still unknown and not widely known. So we have Kun Chayada Suwarachupan, the expert archaeologist from Ayutthaya Historical Park, to moderate this session. Please, Kun Chayada. So good morning, Kun Hattaya. My name is Chayada Suwarachupan, senior archaeologist from Ayutthaya Historical Park. I'll be moderating this second session, which is called Redefining Greater Ayutthaya. So from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. So this session we have 3 speakers who is going to tell us the studies of the Greater Ayutthaya and the unknown studies. So showing the social aspect and historical Ayutthaya society that, are present in the foreign chronicles or records or archaeological evidence that can still be seen today. So in the first session is on Ayutthaya in foreign chronicles and records, particularly from Persian chronicles. So we welcome Dr. Juritpong Jurarat. So before we begin with the talks, I'd like to give you a little bit of background. So he is actually a lecturer in historical department, in linguistics department from Chulalongkorn. He has a PhD in linguistics, majoring in history from Chulalongkorn. He is an expert on Thai history in the Ayutthaya period and also an expert in Middle East history and Thai-Persian relations, Iranian study, Iranian history, Muslim study, and also an expert on Islamic architectural history. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Juritpong Jurarat, please. Good morning, all speakers. So I'd like to share my screen since I have limited time here.
วันนี้เนื่องจากว่าท่านอาจารย์คริสได้ปูพื้นให้เราเห็นเกี่ยวกับเรื่องของประวัติศาสตร์อยุธยาพอสมควรโดยเฉพาะการผ่านจากมุมมองของชาวต่างชาติกลุ่มต่างๆนะครับสำหรับผมเองเนี่ยความเชี่ยวชาญของ
So as Ajahn Chris has already talked about the development in the history of 500 years. So in my expertise, I'm interested in the history that's relevant to the Muslim culture. So I have concluded the studies 2 years ago and found a lot of information, particularly the Ayutthaya that was recorded through the Muslim. So that's another perspective through this foreign document. So that's the background of what I'll talk about today. So the Ayutthaya that appears in Persian document in the 17th century, or King Narai. So my research is on Ayutthaya and Asia in the reign of Shah Sulaiman ship, reflecting from the east in the 17th century. So this particular document was actually written by the secretary of the Persian diplomat in Narai. So the diplomats was actually sent during the reign of King Narai as a reciprocity, where the Thai diplomats were sent to Persian study. So it was a period of 1 year, and it was during the time of the Lalubert, maybe a little bit earlier than Lalubert. And they actually see Ayutthaya in the period of prosperity and commerce, as mentioned by Ajahn Chris, during the reign of King Narai. So this is the document that I studied. There are 2 major documents. First document is kept at British Museum in London. This was actually translated into English and widely used among historians. However, there's a little bit of a problem of the translating from Persian to English. But this document is widely referenced. But the translated version was actually very brief. So the information was a bit problematic. But I'm not going to talk about that. And this document is widely known as Safayan Silamani, which is the Ship of Sulaiman, or King Sulaiman. So the great relation, or the relation that was given to King Narai by the Shah Sulaiman. Another document with the same content, another copy. The version in the British Museum was taken from Iran during the colonial time. So they took some of the documents there. That's why it was found in a British Museum. This second document is found in Iran, in Malik Institution, or the library. That's also in Persian language, but you can see the different letters. The first document was more official, but this one was written in the form of poems, so same content, but differently written. This has been translated in Persian, so I use this as a reference of my study and working with the English version. But I won't be discussing the semantics of it, but we're going to talk about what has been mentioned about Ayutthaya and the physical settings of Ayutthaya. So this is an image of the Shah Sulaiman, or the King of Persian, who sent the diplomat, which actually led to the records that is called the Ship of Shah Sulaiman. In the year 1666 to 1694, that's in the same period of the reign of King Narai. So the king was here when there was already French influence. So before the French influence during King Narai, the royal houses was actually very under influence of Persian and Indian, particularly Muslim from Shia, from Iran. So the royal house of Persian had great influence on King Narai before the politics changed towards the end of his reign. That's why, that's before the French became involved. But what I am saying is this document mentioned on Ayutthaya during what period? So in the document, we don't see the word Ayutthaya from the Persian document, but another word was the city of ships called Shaharanaf. Shahal means city, Nau means ship or Nawa. So Ayutthaya was referred to as the city of water. So Persian came from the city of desert. So when they arrived here, they were amazed and wanted to record the city as the city of waterways and full of ships and boats. So all the records that appears in Persian document will talk about the way of life along the river waterways. First was mentioned was the royal barge processions. So since they were present for about a year, so they mentioned all the ceremonies on the 12 months. But what was the focus here was actually the royal barge, such as how the king was actually moving through the waterways, or all the ceremonies that were conducted in water, particularly towards the end of the year. So one of the ceremony that was recorded is actually the Ayutthaya, or the boat competition, which was held in October. And it was the competition between the king and the queens. And there was also mention about the ceremony about fertility. One of the interesting things that I want to link to what Ajahn Chris has said about what exists underground that is waiting to be studied, I want to talk about the community of Persian and Muslim that exist in Pratnakhon or Kok Mueang city, so which needs to be studied in the future. This is the map by France that shows the Persian settlement in Ayutthaya. So there's actually one road that was called by the French and the European, which is called the Moor Street, which is actually the best street described in Ayutthaya, built by bricks and has distinct design, herringbone design. So this actually was mentioned that it was actually mentioned as Khek Yai Road and called Orchikun. On this road, we find evidence that there was Persian settlement. One of the important evidence is the important ceremony by Persian that was conducted. Even in the Chronicles, they actually that mention this ceremony. And King Narai was mentioned that when he ascended to the throne, he was actually supported by the Persian and went through this ceremony in order to take over the throne. So it can be said that the Persian had reached its peak of civilization during the Prasat Tong until the King Narai's reign. So this is Priya Boran Chatatanin showing the connection from the 17th century French map, which is the discovery of Kokak or Tungkak field, which actually appears as well on the map. Currently now, the area covers many areas, particularly in the Ratchapat University in Ayutthaya. So if you look at the community settlement of Muslim communities, you can see two main communities which exist inside the wall and outside the wall. This map shows the communities, which actually two groups, which is Muslim from Kaktet and Kakcha Malayan. So it's a Muslim from Sunni. So in this world, there are two main sects, right, of Muslim, which is Sunni with about 80% of the population, and Shia, which is the center in Iran. If you can see, the Sunni has more population than Shia, and Shia is considered as minority in Ayutthaya or even now. So this group live outside the city wall. So Jam Malayan actually lived from Khong Ku Jam through Khong Takien Canal. Currently now we have Muslim communities living around the city, and I have done a survey that we find the ancient cemeteries in Ayutthaya, but there has been no detailed study conducted yet, particularly in the areas owned by Muslim. Another group is Kaktet, as mentioned by Ajahn Sisak, which is the connection between the city walls. There are lands that exist around. It has been built as house, a temporary house, which is connected to the raft into the canals. There's a lot of raft, which has actually been center of trade. So we don't really see the ancient Ayutthaya as what is in the present today, because 400 years ago there was a lot of settlement along the river, and we don't see that anymore currently today. The next group is the group that lives inside the city wall, which I explained as the Moor, which is called by the Westerners, consist of mostly Indian people who came from South India, so mostly Muslim from Shia sect or Sung Deccan. There are so many cities that were actually believed in Islam region in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Another group is the Persian group, a little less populated than the Indian, but they are called elites. So they are leaders, as you well known in the cities is Sheikh Ahmad, who would actually the origination of the Bunna clan. So you can see the communities, Persian communities here. The Muslim areas are very sensitive in Ayutthaya. So a lot of architectural excavation, I think you're going to see a lot of evidence. So I'm going to now talk about the Moa Group. So presuming from what appears in the map, we find that the location, as you see from this map, so you can see that it's actually clustered on the land and along the river called Tagayi Port. Tagayi is actually the best place to dock, and canals are connected towards inside to the bazaar or the market. The market is situated in the Moor Road, so it is distinct because it links the wet market or the floating market to the dry market. So there is also big roads that appears here, but currently now there is no archaeological excavation because it actually is the education institutions in the present. If you look at the aerial photos, you can see this is actually a very important location, less priority from the Chinese community. And if you can see that it covers a large area. So I have plotted the original map from France and Persian to the current map. So you can see that there has been no excavation made to see how the Persian communities lived in the 16th and 17th century. If you believe the record from La Loubert, there's about 3,000 to 4,000 community, very large actually. So what is the current area today? So this is called the Cemetery of the Prajao Praya Bawan Ratchanayok, which is actually the origination of the Bunna clan or Sheikh Hamad. So right here you can say that it actually the only milestone that indicates this is the center of Persian community, but this has been built with the certain belief and myth. There is no excavation made that there is archaeological importance, but it is a cemetery, and it is indicated as the cemetery of Jalpraya Bawan Ratchanayok. So this area is actually a religious area called Buri Jiao Sen, the center of Jiao Sen community. So with the Muslim community, there has to be mosque. So it's not built as dome or buildings as you see influenced by the Middle East, but the architecture that's with influence with the mixture of Persian architecture with the local architecture. So it's in the form of tropical architecture. So with the cascading roof for the word panya. Panya is the Persian language called the five elements. So with the belief of the Persian religion from Gudi Jausen, or Persian, it's called Imam Bara or Imam Made, which is actually the house of Imam. So this architecture is influenced by the northern of Iran. So from the study of Persian document, I actually traveled to Iran to do a comparative study in terms of architecture and Persian community in Ayutthaya. So Iran has similar climate as Ayutthaya, which is tropical. So next to the Caspian Sea, so there's a lot of rain, and they plant rice as well, similar to Southeast Asia. So the architecture and religious buildings are using cascading roof as well. So all the religious building can be seen all around in the north of Iran. And from Persian document, you can see that when they lived in Ayutthaya, they were from northern Iran, from Hiran, Mazandaran, or Khorasan. So this is what the Ayutthaya called Iran and Persian Aztec Khorasan. Because most of the Persian from Khorasan, which is on the north next to the Caspian Sea. So all of this would actually link to the architecture and excavation in archaeological sites. That comes later. So another evidence that still persists today is on the ground, showing the influence of the Persian is actually this bridge. This bridge in the past, I asked the Ratchapat Institute to preserve it. And currently now the Fine Arts Department have restored it already. This is the image that I have taken when I tried to ask the executives to preserve this particular site. So only part of it was preserved. So the Fine Arts Department restored this, and this is now called the Sapan Tepmi Bridge. I think it's from the word tesmi in Persian, which is called bridge or tesmi. This is the image after the restoration from Fine Arts Department. It has been restored, modeling the bridge from Iran in the 16th and 17th century. So I studied the architecture in that era. This is the images of the bridges that exist in the ancient time, very similar. So this is another example of the bridge in Safawi of Iran. This is in northern Iran from 16th, 17th century. So the shape of the bridge has been built in the Persian community. So behind this Persian community, before going through the other temple on the glazed ceramic temple or Wat Kabeung Kreup, this is another bridge called Sapan Ban Din Saw. This is what we can see on the ground. There has been no excavation done what is under. So we know that there has been communities that has been built with bricks. So there should be foundations. Because they are mimicking their own culture, which is different from Ayutthaya. So with excavation, we may discover Safawi structure. And you will not see any structure like this in other Southeast Asia. But these areas are all sensitive because it's now a government office and education institution. So I am assuming we may find villages that has housed 4,000, 3,000, 4,000 people. So I tried to study the communities, villages, which is similar to northern Iran. This actually shows the Persian communities in 17th century that was preserved. So the houses appears as by the description in the document. So there's actually two-tiered roof with a courtyard in the middle, very different from Siamese houses in that time. And it has been mentioned that it's been used to house diplomats, Western diplomats. So this type of building is actually quite international standard building, which shows civilization different from other types of houses in Ayutthaya. This is a house that exists in Kwan Kulista, which is also next to the Caspian Sea. This is what is inside the houses, so we are still lacking excavation of this type. I'm showing these images that to show you that Ayutthaya still has many things to be uncovered, maybe a city that still exists within the city. This is an example of the buildings from Iran, and I think the Persian houses will be in the same manner as well if we do excavation. So this is an example of a mosque in Ababo. Babo is in Mazandaran in northern Iran as well. This is how the building is built and blocks are laid, and you can see the techniques of bricklaying. This is the bathhouse, and we find that there are evidence that there might be bathhouse that exists in Safavi era. This is an excavation in Iran, in Kazan. So I have walked around the Kok Mueang Island. I find the stone slab that actually spreads around. So this is actually similar to the bathhouse. This is the last image of the bathhouse because the Persian community, they need the bathhouse, and in Lopburi there is clear evidence that there was a bathhouse. However, there is no evidence that appears in Ayutthaya. So from the study of the document and excavation, maybe it could merge together towards new discovery of Persian communities in Ayutthaya. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ajahn Juritpong. Such interesting presentation, and personally I work at the site and I wonder about the significance of Thungkak field as it appears in the ancient map. And as you mentioned earlier that there was no excavation done in the area due to several factors. But I just wanted to inform you that there was an excavation done in the area of the governor's house before we built any construction. So we found bricks, traces of bricks and complex structure under, which is similar to the bathhouse that you were mentioned. And also at the ancient site, Wat Kraji site, the Fine Arts Department worked with Unesco and excavated under the base of the pagoda, and we found a lot of skeletons. And we are not sure if it has relation with the Persian communities that lived in the area. So maybe in the future we can work together. Do we have any questions? So you will still be here with us until the panel discussion, is that correct? Yes. Yes, we have a lot of questions coming in, but we can consolidate all the questions and then put that the Q&A towards the end. Right, so I'd like to thank Assistant Professor Dr. Juritpong Jutharat for speaking earlier. Next, we have a session that discusses the waterways of Ayutthaya in Ayutthaya period by Dr. Trongchai Hutangkul. He is currently a researcher in Research and Development Division, Sirinthorn Anthropology Center. He has a PhD in history from Anthropology and Sociology Department from University in France. And his special expertise is on environmental archaeology. So some of his significant work is the determination of area and age of the Warawadi ancient coastline by using radiocarbon dating method. And he has a special interest in ancient document and inscription in Sukhothai and Ayutthaya period. So without further ado, please, Dr. Trongchai. Good morning, everyone.
Okay.
So I'd like to share my screen and presentation.
ได้ยินนะครับครับผมงั้นก็ขอเริ่มเลยนะครับพอดีเนี่ย
So you can hear me fine.
ให้นำเสนอข้อมูล
Right.
ของวิทยาซึ่งจริงๆไม่ใช่งานศึกษา
So may I begin?
แต่ว่าเป็นงานศึกษาที่
So I was actually tasked today to present on the waterways in the Ayutthaya period, but this is not my own study, but it is a study that is a part of the proposal to the center to study the archaeology of Ayutthaya and its waterways. And Ajahn Payao Khemna, who is no longer here with us, he actually conducted this study. So I thought this is a great opportunity to present his studies. So I was very honored to be invited by the organizers to present on the waterways of Ayutthaya today. So for more details, you can always follow up with the works of Ajahn Payao. So this particular publication is actually one of his great works that he has left behind. He studies the waterways from the maps and a field survey to study the relations of the waterways. One of the distinct features of his studies, he wanted to try to interpret where the bypass canals and connecting canals are located. And with historical evidence, it appears in the Chronicles, not the Luang Prasert version, but it is present in the detailed chronicled or Glum Chabab Kwam Pisadan called Jantanumat or Pajak Patipong Cha. Or the more recent one is from the royal letters. So I'll elaborate further where they appear. So this particular work, there is another study on the connecting canals on the north of Ayutthaya. So this information does not appear anywhere. So the digging of the bypass canals will appear in Chronicles, but the study in the north of Ayutthaya, he found evidence of the digging which led from the old Chao Phraya map and very complex network. And there's actually a link between Ayutthaya and Lopburi. If you look at the current map, the river runs quite straight. That's not the nature of river. So we believe that it could be dug and which has believed to be existing before Grumsi Ayutthaya is pronounced as the city. And Ayutthaya is probably the closest city to the sea in the Lopburi era. So that's why, the waterways were actually dug for convenience. And this study, he also studied the foreign maps and in comparison with contemporary information and to see the difference and similarities. And another distinct feature is that Dr. Payao wanted to find the description of the waterways that appears in literatures. And I'll particularly talk about the Gamsuan Samut poem and prove and try to argue that it wasn't written in King Narai's era. So let's now first understand the geographical location of Ayutthaya. So in the lower central part is actually a plain that was actually in the ancient time, it was at the level of seawater. 10,000 years ago, it was all sea. So it forms a plain, and you can see the river meanders, and the lower plains of the central part is mainly where the Chao Phraya River is situated. The second important river is the Tajin River, which is smaller, and parallel to those are Manam Meklong and Bangpakong River. So Chao Phraya is actually the main river because it is the biggest river and has the high, very strong sediment flow. And if you observe carefully in the Google map, if you zoom with the satellite image, Tajin River has a lot of bends and meandering, much more than Chao Phraya River, because it has actually been influenced by the sediment, particularly here. So this is the map developed by Ajahn Payao. So I am going to show you several maps which is taken from Ajahn Payao's studies. One of the things that he presented is actually to show that there is actually ancient city that is actually settled along the complex waterways. Back where in history in Bandon Tapet to Tawarawadi until Ayutthaya period. The first point of his investigation, he studied the Chronicles in Ayutthaya and tried to find where the canals were dug. And he found that in history, there's actually 5 times that the canals were dug, 4 of them with definite known years, and 1 time that it was dug to expand the waterway. And you can see that the digging was made from the area from Sam Kok downwards. It doesn't seem complex, and there's not much bend, but after Sam Kok, there's a lot of river meanders. First bend is in Khong Bang Prao Canal, or Khong Ban Bang Prao. So from the original Chao Phraya River, it exits here as canals, and it keeps bending and meandering, and there's not a lot of bypass near each other. So this is also his work where he wants to show where the canals are. The number 1 is not a bypass canal, but it's an expansion, but 2 to 5 is bypass canals. And some of them is not numbered because it was problematic when it was dug. So from the document, it says that there has been an expansion of Samrong Canal in 2041 BE. That's in King Ramatipati II. There is another bypass canal that was dug. That's in front of Chao Phraya River in the Royal Palace, in front of Wat Arun Temple, the Temple of Dawn. So that's a very big river meander, which is now currently called Bangkok Yai and Bangkok Noi Canals. So basically, it's the Bangkok area. So if you look at the number here, number 3 is actually Bang Kroi and Bangkok Bypass Canal, situated towards the north of the Bangkok Bypass Canal. There is I forgot to tell you that Bangkok canal that was in 2065 BE, and this is Banglat Bangkroi bypass canal dug in King Mahachakapat's reign. The year is unknown. And number 4 is the Ban Prao and Bang Luang bypass canal here. So exiting from Sam Kok, and at that time there's a lot of canal bends that actually goes way around, so you can see the bypass canal here that was dug in 2151 BE. There's another bypass canal called Khong Lat Mueang Non in Nonthaburi, and then lastly it's in the Kok Gret Island. In the document it says that it existed in King Tai Sa, but Ajahn Payao found that in the Laluber's publication, that area there was already existence of Kok Gret Island. So he was wondering when this bypass canal was dug up, and why did the Chronicles said it was dug in the reign of King Prajao Tai Sa. But this was his observations. Let's now look at the canals and moats, which is closer to Ayutthaya. It was found, like I said in the beginning, that in the north of Ayutthaya was actually understudied in terms of the river landforms to try to see which ones came first. But Professor Payao is trying to analyze by using the documents and his field survey, and he finds that in this area, particularly in the west of Ayutthaya, there is Bang Ban Canal, which is actually very important, and from the city itself to Bang Ban Canal, there are waterways networks that connects further out. Here you can see Mahana Canal. Mahana Canal flows and link with Mahapram Canal, and it exits at Bang Ban. Another waterway, which is also a bypass canal, called Khong Ban Kum Canal. Originally, it was a bypass canal, but now with the abundant flow of water, it has expanded into the currently what we call the Chao Phraya River. So we will not know, superficially we would never know this was a bypass canal. So with that strong current flow of water that actually erodes the sides of the embankment, it expands the water, and the original Chao Phraya River got smaller and became canals instead. So this is an example of the changes that occur. And in the north of Ayutthaya, we have the Basak River. There are so many observations that can be made here, but he did not did an analysis because it's not really swinging. It has been straightforward. Another river is Menam Lopburi. His analysis was a bypass canal, but that's a very long canal, and he has written about the original Lopburi, which actually had a lot of bends as well. This is significant because if it was actually a real bypass canal, it was actually dug before Ayutthaya was the city, and it was gradually dug and did not have clear direction, which by the Western technology. So the waterways was not very straightforward or linear, so it bends a little bit, but it goes towards Ayutthaya. It's interesting though that Lopburi River was it dug in the ancient method. So the point of this study, Professor Payao tried to analyze from the river meanders and found that there's a possibility that Hantra Canal that is situated in the east of Ayutthaya that curves here like this could possibly be the original Basak River. So because you can see the bends and curves, So digging, straight
ถ้าคลองเหล่านี้
canals, it could have been dug just recently. So this is one of the reasons why he interprets it in ways that if these canals were newly dug to connect the waterways
น่าจะเป็น
to the Kukhuna moat, the Kukhuna moat may not have been dug in the reign of King Tongs,
อโยธยา
but it could have been just original moat. So the
ก่อนหน้า
city moats that existed before Ayutthaya, which he calls Ayutthaya. So this concept was mentioned by Ajahn Sisak that before Ayutthaya there was a city called Ayutthaya in the east.
แล้วก็การขุดคลองเนี่ย
So this image
ก็จะเห็นชัดเจน
presented by Ajahn Payao to show the natural waterways and its network.
แห่ง
And he wanted to show which areas where the canals were dug, and it's been indicated by colors. There are actually 17 locations that he studied with names of canals. Highlighted in blue is I wanted to highlight it as examples. If you want to read further, you can read his work, his publication, and he explains briefly the significance of each waterway. One of the things he focuses on is the Mahapram Canal. What is the significance of the location of this canal? Mahapram Canal actually connects directly between Ayutthaya and the west of Ayutthaya before going towards Suphanburi or going to battles with Myanmar. When Myanmar attacked the city, they came this way as well.
ทำไมถึงเป็น
So as I noted here,
อะไรก็ตามที่มีน้ำรอบๆแบบนี้ครับปกติเขาจะเรียกว่าเกาะ
what Ajahn presented, he calls this the Mahapram Island. So whatever is surrounded by water, we would call it an island, right? So this Mahapram Island is the whole area.
เรียกว่าวัดขนอมวัดขนอ
But
ม
the strategic part is here, which is actually called Huoko, which is actually points toward the direction of Ayutthaya. Here is where the Kanon temple is situated. It serves as the checkpoint where they collect taxes. There are actually 4 of them, and he highlights the Kanon Pukhou. This has been recorded in the Chronicles that when Pama brought their army to attack Ayutthaya during the reign of Prajakapat king, they actually camped in Kanon Pukhou.
ซึ่งต่างจากภาษีก็จะ
So the moat, I am unsure which one it is. They may call some place the moat, but all of this is actually a tax checkpoint. And one of the distinct characteristics is it's situated in the main waterways.
อ่านว่า
So around Ayutthaya, there's a lot of checkpoints, in all directions. So from Ajahn Payao's studies, he is presuming that the Kanon Pukhou that appears in Chronicles is situated in
เส้นทางเนี้ย
Pak Klong Mahapram Canal. And Klong Mahapram Canal is actually one of the important ways where the army travels to battle with Myanmar.
มีการขุดคลอง
But currently, today, from the field study, we find that the canals has become very shallow because there is actually another more canals dug as Klong Bang Ban.
ก็จะไหล
So at the Klong Ban Bang Kum towards here to connect another way towards Ayutthaya. So there was less water to Klong Bang Ban. There would be less water in Klong Mahapram. So, for as 100 years pass, Klong Mahapram becomes more shallow.
พะเยาท่านได้
So this is information and its significance, historical significance to Ayutthaya in the western part. And one of the points that he also focused or highlighted is the interpretation of existence of Pataku Jam and Ayutthaya. So if you read the Chronicles, there is actually one event in the reign of สมเด็จพระยาราม King. So there was a revolution during his reign,
ทำให้สมเด็จพระยารามต้อง
and สมเด็จพระนครินทร์มหาธิราช was invited to take over the throne. So สมเด็จพระยาราม King had to be exiled to พระจาคูจาม So in the works of Ajahn Payal, he interprets that Pathakujam is actually a city at the south of Ayutthaya, the old city. So if he interprets it this way, we could wonder if he was actually exiled and contained in the area or not. And it is possible, then there is a possibility that the Pathakujam is in the south of Kok Mueang Island. So what kind of evidence were there? If you look at the aerial photos, we found that one Pathakujam had 2 bypass canals, which I'll show you an image. And the second point is there's actually a straight moat in the east of Ayutthaya city. And in the image, you can see that he dotted the lines. And this is actually the old moats area of Ayutthaya. So if it's he is actually comparing with the areas similar to Suphanburi, the same range of cities, ancient cities, at the same time. So it's possible that it has in this square image. Then Ajahn Payal is trying to analyze that the scope or area where it is residential and where our communities built or established. So the original Basak River, he said that it should be in the east, and then there is actually canals. This is the original Basak River, and then it bends in front of the Wat Phanan Cheung temple. So that becomes the moats in the east of Ayutthaya. So what he is proposing is the Pukhou moat is actually the original city moat of Ayutthaya. The second point is Hantra Canal is the original Basak River. Third point is from here, it can be interpreted that Ayutthaya existed before Ayutthaya in the reign of King Rama I and Tong King. The fourth point is the city plan of Ayutthaya is square from his aerial photos. So the rectangular, how does this look like? This is Hantra River, but if you look closely, the area of the city wall towards the east is Maheyong Canal. Now it's not as a straight canal as we see today, but some of the parts are cut and been filled in to make residential areas. And in the west is the Pukhou moat, and in the south is the Phranon Canal, and in the north we also see some evidence in Kok Trong Hua Ro Island. This is the military map where he wants to show the rectangular city plan. And towards the south we have evidence of moats. And he claims that we can actually see from the aerial image from 2479 BE, you can see as well. And Pathakujam, important here is the Khongjam Canal, Khongkujam Canal. It actually meets with the Takien Canal Currently today there are two kujams, the large kujam towards the west and the little kujam noi. And he is presuming that the kujam yai from the ancient document there is Kun Lakhon Chai Canal. So from this city plan, it is interesting to see the city planning. And at this point, people may not have discussed this, that there was cities that existed before Ayutthaya, and in surrounding areas, there might be large communities that existed before moving to relocating in 1894. The next point is the poem or the literature. This is an example why when we study the history of moats and canals, we have to also study literature, because literature is actually an example of the documentation of the environment through narratives and description. So one of the classic cases is the Gamsuan Samut poem. It was before believed that it was written by Si Prat, a poet during the King Narai, but through investigation, it was found that Si Prat never existed, which actually talked, and through the documentation, talk about other kings and no evidence of Si Prat. And another point is that whether this poem was actually written during the King Narai's reign. There's a lot of people who did a study on literature review that this poem was maybe written in a much older period, similar to a very hard to understand literature called Twa Tosamat or even Yuan Pai. And it was a very complex literature. And possible or not, Gamsuan Samut would have been that old, but that was the literature analysis. So this study by Ajahn Payao, he actually used the waterways described in Gamsuan Samut poem to actually find out when was it written. Could maybe be written before the bypass canals were dug, because he studied all the areas that were described from Ayutthaya towards out the sea, towards Samut Prakan estuary, and discussed all the locations that were found. I think it was in chapter 53 to 55. There was a description of the waterways actually went around the river meanders and coming back again. So in chapter 55, he talked about passing the Bang Ramat. Definitely, if it goes around Bang Ramat, there was no bypass canals Bangkok that I talked about. So without that bypass, it means that this poem, Gamsuan Samut, was written before 2041 BE at the very least. So we can argue that this poem was not written in the reign of King Narai. So using that literature and the study of waterways. So this is something unknown maybe to a lot of people in trying to prove the age of the document. So I think that was one of the great works that he has left behind. So that's about the 20 minutes I have. I'd like to end here. The works of Ajahn Payao, there's so many interesting points that can be read and studied. And if we go back to his publication, this particular book was actually published by Pramongkol Bapit Foundation in Ayutthaya. So there's actually 500 copies. And if you're really interested, you can always borrow this book from our library, Sirinton Anthropology Center. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Dr. ตรงใจ for presenting the waterways of Ayutthaya. This actually shows the knowledge of water management back to Ayutthaya. And Ayutthaya is truly a city of water. And this has actually been incorporated as one of the outstanding universal values. Next, I'd like to invite Kun Veerasak Sansa'at, so the next speaker, to talk about the new findings about Ayutthaya Kingdom. He is actually an archaeologist in the Ayutthaya National Park from the Fine Arts Department. So he has been working in Ayutthaya since 2012. So he graduated from archaeology degree from Silapakon University and has worked in excavation of ancient palace and archaeological sites in Ayutthaya province, in Ayutthaya city as well. Please.
ก็เดี๋ยวขออนุญาตอาจจะต้องให้โอเคขอบคุณครับดร.ตรงใจเดี๋ยวจะขออยากจะเห็นหน้าจอก็ในส่วนของผมนะครับ
I'd like to share the screen. This is like revisiting the monuments, the evidence, and the works that has been done in terms of the national park in the past 7 years, because there's a lot of the excavation sites and there's a lot of interesting evidence that has been found.
คู่นะครับก็เพื่อไม่การเสียเวลาก็อย่างที่
And without wasting time, as you understand earlier, in the past 7 years, we have conducted a lot of important works inside the national park. And you can see here that this is the map. So it consists of the island in the middle and also the other surrounding areas, in total of 7 areas. And this has been divided in the first master plan, since the first master plan. And we used the 7 regions, so both in terms of conducting the studies and to safeguard the area. And you can see the different canals, moat. And next, let us begin the presentation. But I have to tell you that I'm not going to go into the details, because this is more just a review. So the first one, we had conducted excavation in the ancient Grand Palace. So we had dug surrounding areas, and from the evidence found, we had discovered 3 key interesting findings. The first one is we found the walls, and we suspect that actually it divides between Phai Na and also Phai Nai. So Phai Na actually consists of the male, and Phai Nai are those who are the females residing in the royal court. So looking at the ground, you do not see the wall, but once we had conducted the excavation, then you see here, so from Pramazamdet to Pratinang Sanpet, you can see that actually the wall is quite large. And we had found the underground waterways and also the pipe works, which we can suspect that there is the management of water already. And then also you have fountains in the garden, and also the pipe works are what we have found. Most importantly, on the left top, so that's in Parihan Somdet, we had excavated and we had discovered that, sorry, the sound quality is very compromised. We're trying our best to make of what he's saying, but the words are really challenging to understand. So on the top left, we found charcoal, and then actually when we conducted charcoal dating and conducted carbon dating, it actually goes back to Prasat Tong period. So the question is, does that link to the time of the fire, and then perhaps the new monument has been built in place of the one that has burned down? But however, we need to conduct further studies to understand. And the next one is in Praksi Sanpet Temple. And so we see that actually on the east of the temple, one of the key ruins, one of the key monuments you can see here, you can see the wall, which we suspect that is the wall of the temple. And it is very close actually to Papa Lelai, so near the Bihar. So what we suspect is actually the boundaries of the temple was not that large, and later on, in the different periods that follows, the old walls had been destroyed and there has been an expansion of the boundaries of the temple. And another excavation, another discovery that we found is on the right. So that is the building that has been reconstructed throughout different era. So initially it was in the shape of mondop, which is a square. So you can see that on the left it's deeper, and then in the next period, the next era, you can see the mondop now became the Bihar. So you can see the different era, it follows different reconstruction. But if you look at the actual surface, you can see that they're renovated in different periods. And here you can see the usage of Bihar is also based on these floorings. And then another evidence that identified that Passis and Pet had actually gone through different renovation and conservation are these following excavation evidence. So this is the original excavation. We dug down to almost 3 meters, and you can see there's laterite, silalang used here. And I was working with another archaeologist, and then a lot of the pieces of the shackles had been used to identify carbon dating, and actually it goes back to around BE 1767 to 1834 for this era. So these areas, therefore, the assumption is made that there are some communities living in this area. And maybe before, the communities were really small, and perhaps the names were not identified. Perhaps they were the original Ayutthaya population and residents. And however, this one needs further studies to identify the facts. And so therefore these are the new excavations and these are the new findings. And in the two areas, the Prashawang one and also Wat Prasi Sanpet Temple, it's a highly populated area. Therefore, the excavation, it is quite sensitive and we need to be careful during the excavation as we do need to preserve the different renovation and the different traces of the different period of the conservation and renovation and different interventions. And another new discovery is in Wat Tanon Jin, so Tanon Jin Temple. From the archaeological excavations, we had identified several Chinese artifacts, which coincides with the other fact that this area used to be a large market and it was quite active in terms of trade. And the assumption that the craftsmen and the Chinese actually resided in this area, or at least they commanded the construction of the Chinese artifacts and the Chinese statues. We also had found Tawarawadi era sculptures, and this also identify that actually during the Ayutthaya period, there was the imports of the artifacts from the different surrounding countries and the cultural empires. And there's also another famous element, for example, the Talawadi, which is the Buddha statue that you might be familiar of in a different temple. And another important finding, the new discovery is this, which is the tombstone, the Chinese tombstone. So actually, the dating actually follows to the BE 2300, so just a few years before the Great Wall in Ayutthaya. So it is under the assumption that there are Chinese cemeteries in the area, but however, we do not find other evidence. And Kratji Temple, you can see here, this is the crypt. Kratji is another temple, which is also in the middle of the island, the Ayutthaya island. So JD here on the ruins is the shape and the design is something that's commonly found in Ayutthaya period. And from actually the excavation, we have found the crypt, and it was a cemetery. So the burial was conducted without cremation, and perhaps this is the first cemetery found inside the island, and we have not yet identified any religious artifacts that could identify what religion practice this one has. And the shape of the bodies, the remains, were lying flat, and so you can see in this image. And other artifacts that were found were silverware, silver bracelets, and there were some artifacts that is suspected to be amulets from Ayutthaya period. However, that does not conclude what culture this remains are from. But from the remains, we suspect that it's actually those who were from outside Ayutthaya. Those were the foreigners, that was the assumption. And another, these are the Hindu temples. So in the area that is suspected to be the area of the shrine, you see that actually it's built with bricks, and what has been found is actually it might be a renovation of the old Buddhist JD, and it had turned into a Hindu architecture. And we found parts of linga, and you can see here Sivalung. That was part of linga of Shiva, and therefore it is suspected and assumed that this was the shrine, the Hindu shrine, the Hindu temple. And another new discovery is around the city walls. And you can see here that on the west, near Ayutthaya JD, there's a project for flood management and flood water barriers. So we had to conduct assessment projects to see what would be the impact of the heritage site, the heritage impact assessment. And what we had discovered is we found traces of the bricks that signified the shape of the wall. And from preliminary findings, we assumed, based on the interviews and also based on existing documentations, we suspect that this was the wall of the city. And after identifying such walls, we had consulted the team and we agreed to move the barrier, the flood barrier, further so that it does not impact the ancient city wall. And those that are underground, we had preserved the area and we had protected the area. And another discovery is Pom Pratu Khao Plek, which is the wall, the door, Khao Plek door, and it is probably the only door in Ayutthaya period that surrounds both sides of the canal, the moat, the clong, and you can see that it has been probably used in different era and different periods throughout, maybe 2 or 3 periods. And Clong, this one is also what Ajahn Rongchai has mentioned earlier. We studied about some of the Clong and the waters in which has been used and flowed into the Grand Palace. And from the different excavations, we found many new discoveries. On the top left, we saw the water doors, the water gates, and it has been used with the main structure is made from bricks, and then also wood has been used as a supporting structure. And the bottom left, you can see here the Grand Palace, and it has the water walls, the water barriers. And on the right, these are the traces of the bridge, and this one links from the east to the west. So the water that links from there. So actually the new bridge sits above the ancient bridge, and we refer to the neck of the bridge and to the legs to actually identify the locations and the shapes. And this is Ban Luang Rap Ratchatut, so the ambassador residence. So from the excavations, we had identified artifacts, as you can see here. You have ceramics, you have potteries, and then also porcelain. And the highlight is actually this glassware, and also statues of men with mustache. And so it is suspected and assumed that they are Europeans. And a lot of the artifacts that were here actually comes from many different empires and different kingdoms. So we also found a lot of the evidence, but however, we had to stop the excavation. We need to ask for a future collaboration with the province for further excavation and studies. And this one is something that happens quite often in Ayutthaya, because Ayutthaya itself, you have to understand that it is both a heritage site and also an urban city. And so therefore, whenever somebody wants to construct a building, we need to identify if there is any heritage impact. And if the area overlaps with the heritage site in the maps, then the Fine Arts Department would coordinate with the owner of the land to ask for the permission to conduct heritage impact assessment and to identify whether there would be any monuments or artifacts under, or if the area would have an impact to the heritage and to the monuments. And you can see on the left, that is the hall in which we had conducted in an area in which a hotel was to be built. So that's actually inside the city. And one interesting thing is, so this area is where we find the remains of fire. So that land scale actually is several centimeters in width, and so and in depth. And so therefore these are the findings, and you can actually find historical significant evidence, and that can be preserved for future studies. And that is under Ratchapat University in Ayutthaya, because the renovation is about to be done, and they want to renovate the landscape, and so therefore it's really close to the ancient mode, and so we had to conduct HIA to ensure that no heritage site has negative impacts. And the next one, which is the one that a lot of the general population had paid a lot of interest to, it's Pukhou Tong Temple, and we had identified something really interesting. We found that underneath this ubosot that you can see here in the key temple, the key church area here, it probably used to be the main ubosot, right? Prathan, the main statue used to reside here. And the discoveries actually showed that perhaps there were other building structures that linked to the main building in itself. And therefore, this is the old traditional ancient architectural design. So the other secondary structure leads to the main ubosot. So therefore, it can be assumed perhaps that Wat Pukhou Tong, one of the main ubosot, is right here. And over time, there were a new, Pukhou Tong monuments being built, structures being built, and during the middle Ayutthaya period and the last period of Ayutthaya, the late Ayutthaya period, more renovations were done and a lot more constructions were renovated. And you can see the brick patterns actually were a bit different, and you can see bricks were in the shape of the hexagon, and it's not just square, right? So the way that they form the bricks formations and the patterns also differ. And this is also really interesting. This one is the kiln. So it's a Nang Leung kiln. It's in the northern of the Ayutthaya island. So we had identified a ceramics kiln site, and it used to be a huge industrial ceramics area. And before Ayutthaya, we usually focused on the excavations of the temples and monuments, and we actually identified a kiln, an ancient kiln. And this is quite large. So you can see here we had identified many kilns, and you can see here there's at least 4 in this image. And I believe the Fine Arts Department Regional Office 3 probably have future projects for the excavation of these kilns. And this one is towards the east. It's probably the only project that is ongoing in the east. And you can see here in the map, and then also on the left, we had seen the renovation, the building itself, the bihar, actually have the late Ayutthaya period facade and the art decoration. And it's really close to the railway. So the railway is the red line. The good thing is, in the future, the railway authority, when they want to expand their renovation, the temple would fall under the protection and conservation of the different heritage impacts. And another interesting discovery is we have the Wet Temple and Tahoi Temple. So we had found here the highlight is actually the Bihar, or tamnak. Sometimes you call it tamnak, sometimes you call it vihar. And the building here is a pilanda design. So you can see the facade actually is a mixture of European design. So what is really interesting is it's like a veranda style. And so you can see it's a mixture of different cultural elements. And this therefore leads to another OUV. And you can see that Ayutthaya has this combination and a mixture, and it borrows the significant elements and different attributes from the Western, the Ayutthaya, and then also it leads to its own OUV. And here you can see that the little port here, it's like a fishbone pattern, and the bricks which has been laid out in such a fishbone design, you can see here that it links down. And Wat Tha Hoi, which is the temple right across the Wat temple, right across it. So actually seeing the two of them and finding the little pier here, you can actually identify the length and the width. So you can identify the width of the clong, the moat. So you can see this dotted yellow line are what we suspect to actually be the body, right? The width of the body of waters. And you can see actually it used to be much wider than the current moat that we have. Canal here. So it used to be bigger, and I think it used to be large enough in which boats can also travel. So I talked to some of the elderlies, and they say the elderly said 60, 70 years ago, actually you can still use a boat, on this area, and actually some larger vessels can also pass through. Why did they come? Because they came to take and to smuggle actually the ancient bricks for sale, and they were still there back in 60, 70 years ago. So back then there was still some canal large enough. This is Chiang Kai, and you can see that actually part of the flood management is to build the water barriers here, but during the excavation before the construction project started, you found actually the ancient elements in the monuments. So here you can see that the original edge here, it's here, the ling is here. And you can see that there are different renovations, and then after you dig through, you see the evidence of the different periods. And you can see here with the bricks on the left, it's a bit on sided formation. And what you can see here is it used to be a large pier, so it probably used to cater the bigger boats and the bigger vessel. And some people used to say that actually this is where elephants actually commute. So the elephants can actually come up on the boat through this pier, and they also deck here. Also dock here. Also, you can see here. And on the left, it used to be one of the Kumai Lom areas, so which the royal barge used to be here. That's where they go. So just in conclusion, the archaeological discoveries in Ayutthaya, we have not stopped, and we have continuously discovered new archaeological evidence, and also we had continuously submitted the different samples to conduct carbon dating based on the evidence, and we also had conducted different studies of the different artifacts to ensure the triangulation and also to ensure the accuracy of the existing evidence. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you so much, Kun Virasak, for all of the findings of the new archaeological discoveries about Ayutthaya Kingdom in the past 5 to 6 years. It has been very useful, and it allowed us to see how important Ayutthaya Kingdom is. You also have the ancient Grand Palace. You also have different religious factors, different ruins. You have the Hindu, you have the Buddhist. You have also a lot of information that also refers back to the different information presented by the panelists earlier. And you can see the complexities of Ayutthaya Kingdom as an important heritage site. And we have some moments left for Q&A. And for the first question,
Uh, เป็นวิทยากรท่านใดดีคะ
พอดีสัญญาณหายไปครับเลยไม่
I think there was an internet
เป็นคำถาม
problem.
พอดีสัญญาณเมื่อกี้
I cannot hear the question. So the transition from Ayurveda into Ayutthaya, is there evidence? Or do you still use the beliefs based on infectious disease and pandemic to identify that transitional phase?
คริสอยู่ไหมคะอาจจะเชิญอาจารย์ช่วยเริ่มตอบ
Ajahn Chris, are you still there? Can we invite you to give the first answer?
อาจารย์อยู่กับเราไหมคะ
โอเคถ้าออกมาพอดี
ผมไม่ได้เห็นอะไรใหม่ๆจากนั้นเลย
I didn't see anything new from that. Actually, I mean, that's it, right? Like from the old archive, all the old chronicles, right? That's the existing evidence we found. I don't think there's anything new. Yes, I would like to add, when I was in Silapagan University studying history, I had looked at and surveyed the ancient city and the structure and the techniques of building the religious temples. Wat Maheyong, for example, you can see in the center, you'll see JD that still reflects the old traditional way, and then so it reflects the arts in which we call Supannapum arts, which we can find in Sankhaburi and Suphanburi area. And so in terms of the artistic significance, besides the different chronicles and archives, we can see that there are some techniques which precedes Ayutthaya period. So therefore, this reflects that the communities were already existing there. And this is from my personal experience conducting surveys 10 to 20 years ago. And I think I would like to answer based on the archives. So first you have to understand the definition. Ayutthaya and Ayurveda. So Ayutthaya is the city in the east, right? The east of the Ayutthaya island. So Ayutthaya, we're actually talking about Ayutthaya island itself. The question is there any evidence of the transition between Ayutthaya to Ayutthaya to Ayutthaya? And where is that? And where's the evidence? I think the oldest one, the earliest one is going to be in the Chronicle. And it falls back into BE 1794. So actually, if you trace back to earlier, you can actually see there's been controversy and also a fight between Lahu and Xian. So Xian is what? Xian is Suvarnabhumi, right? And Lahu, which is what? Lawo, right? So the combination of Xian and Lawo, this is based on the Chinese chronicles, right? So the question is, when did they transition? When did they move? We don't know officially when, but we guess that based on the chronicle, it's around the 18th BE century. So would it be based on the pandemic? Was the pandemic the element that caused that move? Was it the pandemic or an infectious disease that caused that migration? So I think these has to be divided into 2 points, right? The first one is definition. The second one is the question about infectious disease. What we have are only legends. We only have legends. And the question is, are there other factors, right? if you look in terms of development, I believe it is more of the state that needs to be developed and it needs to grow, right? So in terms of Ayutthaya, it did not come directly from Suphanburi or Tong. I'm just tracing back, I'm referencing the Chinese Chronicles. So we're talking about combining Suvarnabhumi and Lahore, which is Lahore, right? So these are the legends, right? And of course, like when it's based on legends, sometimes it adds these elements which makes it exciting. And the question is always how much of that are facts. But another thing is when you talk about what are the differences between Ayutthaya and Ayutthaya, and based on a lot of the historical findings by many in the academe, they used to say actually Ayutthaya, you should refer to Ayutthaya before Ayutthaya went through the Great War, the first time when they lost the war. So Ayutthaya should stop right there, right? So that should be the period in which we still call Ayutthaya. Otherwise, the general public get really confused, right? So you can see some of the academia, they actually call Ayutthaya and Ayutthaya, but actually we call Ayutthaya after Ayutthaya lost the war. So actually when we talk about Ayutthaya, it's, until what? Tong. So Ayutthaya is something that existed before Ayutthaya. If you have any other questions, please feel free to ask.
งั้นเป็นคำถามข้อต่อไปเลยนะคะ
And the next question is it's on Persian culture. So besides architectural influence, what are the other influence from Persia that we see in Ayutthaya? So as you can see, actually the monuments near the governor's house, that's also really interesting because you had discovered a lot of glassware. And back in the days, we used to assume they are from Europe, but actually in Persia, Iran had already a lot of glassware and also ceramics. I'm not sure if you had found the Safavi ceramics. They're very similar to Chinese ware, like glassware and stoneware, because back in the days, the Persian kings, they really were supportive of the export, right? Because back in the days, they were really supportive of creating these ceramics, because back in the days, the Chinese China were really influential, right? And then so later on, the Persian leaders, the Persian kings, the Persian shahs actually imported the Chinese potters, right? The Chinese potters actually were influencing. So actually, the Safavi that's made in Persia is very similar to Chinese ceramics. And if you're not the Safavi specialist, Safavi ceramic specialist, you might be confused and you may assume that these are the Chinese ceramics. And in some areas that actually it overlaps between the Persian and the Chinese, you may see more Persian influence, right? It could be glassware, it could be ceramics. But one of the most significant things is actually how one dresses. So textile, cloth, you can see from the mural paintings, you can see in the fine arts, because back in Ayutthaya, what has been very popular is actually Persian, right? So we actually order them from India, right? So of course you don't see the textile left because it's been quite some time. You might see pieces out of the leftovers besides, those pieces that has been really reserved by collectors. But actually in Japan, in Nara, you still have textile. You have Persian and also Indian textile. One that found in Nara was from Southern. So Ayutthaya was a big trade hub, right? So Ayutthaya was huge. Ayutthaya used to be the hub for textile trade. And they sent to China, they sent to Japan. And where is it used? It's been used in the royal ceremonies by the empire, by the emperor in Japan. And then you can also see some of these Persian textiles has been used to make kimonos in the royal court, in the imperial court. So therefore, what we see is actually that we also are influenced by many cultures, not only India and China, where it's also Persian and many more. So there is no such thing as the pure influence, but a lot of them are integrated and a lot of them are a combination of different cultures. And so one of the works I did was the Persian arts towards the late Ayutthaya era. It's actually influenced by Persian. What we understood as like pure Thai is actually influenced, and one of them is the Persian culture that influenced them.
ขอบคุณนะคะก็สำหรับคำถามต่อไปนะคะ
So thank you very much. Then the next question is on the trade in Ayutthaya. So what are the other relations to other cities in Siam, and what are the significance besides collecting tax?
ผมพูดก่อนก็ได้ครับก็จะพูดในมุมของ
I can go first. I'll talk about the Persian and Indian influence. So the parallel port city at that time is Masulipatam port, and the southeast of India. We trade with them a lot because if you draw the path, it's going to emerge in Marit city since the King Narai's era. So what do we trade with them? We trade elephants with India. So they do use a lot of elephants for their warfare, and also textile. In Persian document, we send about 150 elephants per year to trade with them. So sending elephants, large animals like that, it's seen as one of the warfare. So there has been like the government trade. You can see the government trade with India. And once elephants arrive there, elephants will yield a very high price due to very good quality of elephants, so easily trained. Aside from that, we have also trade fragrant timbers with them. Grisana, Gamyan, Galampak timber, and these fragrant woods are being sent to India. So trading with China would actually be in big bulk, but in India we get really good prices. Although these fragrant woods is very, high price. And we trade them. We would trade rose water with India, or textile, or even horses. So we would get Persian horses will be bred in India before importing them to Thailand or in Ayutthaya. So these are some of the products and commodities being traded. Those are high value. Or even there is history of trading gemstones. So Pranarai king orders, or maybe selling rubies. And sometimes these commodities or gemstones are hidden to trade. However, we need to piece together these types of evidence. So we don't really see that bulk trade with China with India, but the trade can be seen as high values. Anyone else would like to add?
เคยอ่านครับคร่าวๆก็จะมีพวกกับช่วงที่ติดต่อกับดัชนะคือหนังกวางเป็นหนังกวางเด็ด
So there has been also a trade with the deer skin or animal skin with the Dutch. So that has been mentioned as well in the document, and very high in value. So other products similar to what Dr. Julitpong, like fragrant wood, so that's from the Chinese documentation.
ต่อไปนะคะก็จะเป็นคำถามเกี่ยวกับ การบริหาร
Next is the question in management. So the question is on the management of Ayutthaya city and the balance between development and conservation, and what kind of tools do we have, and what kind of challenges do we face? Maybe Kun Weersak can address this. So in terms of management, Ayutthaya is a historical city. So in the historical city, there are many rules and regulations, and Ayutthaya Island is also been pronounced as the heritage site. So in a past couple of 5 years, a lot of discussions has been made. We talk together, we work with the Fine Arts Department, conservation agencies to discuss how the city can grow and develop, and whatever can be made to be able to conserve all these archaeological sites. And in the future, I think it's important for us to develop a master plan to be imposed to the whole historical city. And maybe we need to study targeted management plan and maybe consolidate the authority of all the agencies together, so the city can also develop and coexist with the conservation of these historical sites. Maybe Dr. Montira can add in terms of management. Tomorrow, we are going to discuss in details about management. So if you're asking about the existing tools, we're going to have many presentations from experts on legal instruments, social measures, measures that it's going to help with the protection and conservation of these cultural heritage sites. Please, Dr. Montira, if you have anything to add. I think we'll discuss more in depth in the next session. So next question is the relation between Persia and Siam is only present in Ayutthaya era, or it can be found in other cities as well? I think I can address that. Aside from Ayutthaya, what has been mentioned in the Persian document and also architectural traces. So I have a degree in architecture as well. So in Lopburi province, we can see traces of Persian influence, particularly in the palace of Pranarai king. So similar to Ayutthaya, there is a period since Tawarawadi era until Narai king's reign. There has been in order to build a city and expansion of cities. The city plan itself is very important. It's very interesting because it's very lengthy. So in a lengthy period, so first 10 years, you can see the first influence from Persian and Indian, and it's clearly written and been documented, telling stories about this architectural settings or how it's being influenced by the Persian culture. The Persian ambassador actually resided in Lopburi more than Ayutthaya because there's actually two sides of politics there supporting the France, like Falcon, because so they didn't want Narai king to negotiate with Persian. So the Persian was actually residing residing in Lopburi, and French resided in Ayutthaya. So they had the best leverage and negotiations, and French actually offered better deal. So Persian mostly spent their time in Lopburi because it was actually built to accommodate Persian ambassadors, and there has been many buildings particularly built to receive the guests. And there were also mosques, and Muslims actually performed the prayers there and in those mosques. So we have traces a lot of Persian influence because there is influenced by the Indo-Persian. So just as the Diwani or large open theater to receive ambassadors, so like Grecian area. So if they can actually open and close with the tarp if they wanted to, it can be used to perform music. They can use to perform court rulings. So very Persian influenced. So these we still have limited knowledge in terms of Muslim architecture. So sometimes we don't understand, like the 12 thrones or foyers is actually used for. So it's actually very narrowly led to the throne, for example. So very similar setting to Iranian palace. So in the period of time, you can see clear Persian culture flourish in Lopburi, because in the Persian document, it has been mentioned that Rai King has actually utilized these craftsmen from the Persian, and the water management, which is tropical. It's a tropical way of management. The French has came much later, so they were not crediting Asian influence on this. So they're always claiming that they have developed this, but we actually had this for a long time. Many thrones and palace, if you're interested, if you look at the structure, architecture of Panarai Rajaniwed and how that was influenced by Persian and Indian culture. So it's just not Ayutthaya, really, or even Songkhla. Songkhla is interesting. Songkhla is a mix between the Muslim fortress and the Western city that emerged in the 17th century in Prasat Tong King and Pratao Song Tam King. So it has never been influenced before. So that there were also changes in the city walls and weapons. So, and one of the things that we have selected to Thailand is from Persian or India before we were influenced by the West or Portuguese. And maybe last question. From Nakhon Phanom province. So they are now in the process of nominating the Pratat Phanom Temple as World Heritage. So they had a lot of challenges, whether it's the public participation or local influential factors. So the question is, how do we actually progress in the nomination to the World Heritage if we are facing a lot of challenges and resistance from the local communities?
ขออภัยค่ะเมื่อกี้สัญญาณฝั่งบนขัดข้องรบกวนคำถามสั้นๆอีกทีได้ไหมคะ
การขึ้นทะเบียนมรดกโลกค่ะในที่อื่นๆเนี่ยค่ะมีปัญหามีส่วนร่วมของประชาชนในพื้นที่อิทธิพลการเมืองในท้องถิ่นหรือไม่แล้วก็มีวิธีในการแก้ปัญหาเหล่านี้อย่างไรแล้วก็ที่จะระหว่างวิธีการในการผลักดันให้เกิดมรดกโลกเนี่ยค่ะทำได้อย่างไรบ้าง
ค
ค่ะแน่นอนค่ะมีนะคะแล้วก็มีตัวอย่างแหล่งอื่นๆที่
So definitely there are challenges. However, there is actually great examples or failure as an example or lesson learned from other attempts to nominate the heritage and the conflicts and resistance. So the World Heritage nomination, there might not be an earlier engagement from the beginning, and that may be the cause of resistance, and it can be aggressive as the causing the whole progress to fail. So the lesson learned from the work that we've been doing is how do we create understandings from the earlier stage, from actually going into tentative list before the full nomination. There needs to be a clear understanding of what are the advantage and disadvantages of being inscribed as World Heritage, and how the conservation and protection is going to lead to socio-economic benefits. And also there needs to be clear understanding of the value of the site itself or the property itself. Because similar to what we discussed since 9 o'clock, if Ayutthaya or Thai people have great in-depth understanding about the values of Ayutthaya along what have been presented in the morning, I think everyone will see that Ayutthaya is actually is truly the World Heritage and deserving of the good management and good heritage management. And I think it's important for everyone to recognize the values as mentioned by Ajahn Sisa and Ajahn Chris, the values of these properties and sites in all dimensions, going through the history of time and the development throughout the time, through centuries. All of this will actually be a good start in engaging a true understanding of the World Heritage. And if there is knowledge as well as in-depth understanding, I think it is actually a great start for collaborative work that would lead to the common goal and with less friction, less conflict as possible.
ขอบคุณดร.มนทิรานะคะก็บัดนี้ก็สมควรแก่เวลา
Thank you, Kun Montira.
ในการบรรยายในช่วงที่2ของวันแรกนะคะ
So that's the end of the second session, Redefining Greater Ayutthaya. I'd like to officially end the session 2. Thank you all our experts. I'd like to now hand over the floor to Dr. Ayutthaya to take us to the third session in understanding the greater value and significance of historical city of Ayutthaya. Thank you very much.
Can ได้ยินใช่ไหมคะ
ได้ยินครับ
ขอบคุณมากนะคะแล้วก็ขอบคุณท่านวิทยากรทั้ง3ท่านจากในช่วง
Thank you all the speakers from the second panel, อาจารย์สุริพงษ์ Dr. จงใจ และก็วีรศักดิ์ for all the information shared and for sticking around to answer the Q&A, and thank you Dr. Chris for still being here with us. So next session is actually a connection to what we've already been discussing, but maybe we want to focus on the value of the historic city of Ayutthaya, as mentioned by Dr. Montira, to be inscribed as the World Heritage. The authenticity and the outstanding universal value is very important. So yes, Ayutthaya has been inscribed as World Heritage, but as time goes by, the understanding and of these values has been developed through time, because it's been 30 years. So I think it's worth looking back to these values and to see how Ayutthaya has been protected and conserved. As Ayutthaya itself and the areas, you can see that the value is actually exceeding the attributes and criteria prescribed by the World Heritage. So we want to welcome our experts for this session. Dr. Trong Chai, Dr. Juritpong is still here with us. Kun Montira is with us from Unesco Bangkok. Kun Waropat Wongjaturaphat. Kun Waropat is an architecture and a retired architecture from the Fine Arts Department. He is Ayutthaya. He lives in Ayutthaya himself. So all through this time, Dr. Waropat, he is still always working on Ayutthaya. And another speaker, another legend of Ayutthaya is Kun Sawitri Suwarnasathit, or Pinui. She was the director of NATCOM, Ministry of Education, that was overseeing the World Heritage Convention at that time, and also took part when Ayutthaya was prescribed as World Heritage in 1991 as well. So all of these speakers would actually want to share with us the great value of Ayutthaya.
อย่างที่เราทราบกันอยู่แล้วนะคะว่าเมื่อพูดถึงอยุธยาเนี่ยสิ่งที่เราเห็นเราทุกคนยอมรับว่าสำคัญแน่นอนก็คือทั้งโบราณสถานวัดวา
So the temples, architectural sites, ancient monuments in Ayutthaya Islands and its extended parameters. So with this panel discussion, maybe I want to ask our 6 speakers. So aside from what we have mentioned since 9 in the morning, what are other what can actually depict the value of Ayutthaya that should be known more to the public and should be conserved? So what else should be known to the public on the values of Ayutthaya? Maybe I can invite Kun Montira first. Thank you, Dr. Hattaya, and all the experts who are here with us. I think the first two, the earlier session was quite interesting on the new findings. So I'd like to now maybe sum up a little bit of what we have been discussing this morning. So the general public maybe know Ayutthaya as this image. So the Ayutthaya Island, historical city with some of archaeological sites, as we all know it. But this morning, we have heard from Ajahn Sisak, Ajahn Chris, Ajahn Surisapong, and Dr. Trong Chai and Kun Virasak on other dimensions and other evidence that may be, the new findings in Got Mueang and has expanded our knowledge in terms of the time and also the physical knowledge on Ayutthaya, as well as the waterways that actually links to the Gulf of Thailand even, and also diverse culture that has influence from these foreigners who has actually passed through or visited Ayutthaya in the past, and also archaeological evidence that reflects these historical aspects. And those may be leads to new findings in Ayutthaya, making these evidence more known. So this actually transformed our knowledge on Ayutthaya. So in the past, we may focus on the history and protection. I think it's important for us to expand the parameter of protection and conservation in the future, to expand that boundary and to larger paradigm. As mentioned by Dr. Hataya, that the World Heritage Area at the moment is part of the Ayutthaya Historical Park in the west of Ayutthaya Island. So that's the set boundary. Maybe Ajahn Savitri can inform us why this area was selected, and also the royal palace and temples. But after hearing that in the morning, it does not cover other areas of the Ayutthaya Historical Island. However, Ayutthaya has already been gazetted under the Act on Ancient Monuments, Antiques, and Objects of Art and National Museum. So if we were to expand the boundary, for it to be in alignment with these new evidence and findings, what would be the mechanism on how we expand this in order for us to be able to cover other areas of what has mentioned by Dr. Trongchai, Ajahn Chris, or Ajahn Sisak, who was our first keynote speaker this morning. So we had evidence of Ayutthaya city and other evidence that exists around the Ayutthaya island. And definitely it has, it does not have less value at all, from the World Heritage works in ways that there is a principle that protection of the World Heritage area shall be inspirational and serves as a great best example to protect other types of area as well, whether it's other areas or the connecting area. So this is an outstanding example, but we don't want to say that the World Heritage would be an obstacle to protect other areas. And we don't want it to be that if that's not a World Heritage, it shouldn't be protected. What exists around should not be overlooked, should be well protected and funded. So with the evidence and the new findings, you can see the significance and the values of these connecting areas as well. And that's over the boundary of the World Heritage. This is consistent with the concepts from the master plan of the Fine Arts Department. So this could be a start of our discussion. Maybe we can start with
ในช่วงเริ่มต้นเลย
อาจารย์สาวิตรี
การนำเสนออยุธยาเป็นมรดกโลกเมื่อ 30 ปีที่แล้ว
When we started the nomination process 30 years ago, so I find in my understanding there needs to be a first master plan, a second master plan. So the value of Ayutthaya was already recognized. Can you maybe Kun Savitri? So first, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to all the speakers this morning for actually opening up a lot of points for discussions. The World Heritage is not only the dimension of the archaeological sites. So Sukhothai and Ayutthaya has been inscribed the same year, but Sukhothai, we have been working with Unesco 10 years before Sukhothai was inscribed, and I work closely with Fine Arts Department since the Kun Nikom as Director General, and Kun Nikom they have been very active. Sukhothai, Sichatsanalai, Gampang Phet, we worked it in a way as international campaign. As an example of conservation, we established there is an international committee that meets annually, chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Education. So it's a very high profile project, and we would, always would organize, exhibitions many times at the General Conference. But Ayutthaya itself, it has great significance for Thai people. If Sukhothai is inscribed as World Heritage, if Ayutthaya don't make it as a World Heritage, we would lose face. So it was last minute to nominate the two, but there was no work done nationally, But when it was nominated and inscribed, I moved and relocated to the cultural department. So I was able to work more closely, and also the university also worked with us. So I'd like to tell you on the point that on the values of Ayutthaya, the focus is basically on Ayutthaya and Sukhothai. Were inscribed as historic city. Sukhothai is historic town of Sukhothai and associated historic town. And Ayutthaya proposed as the historic city and associated cities, and then the Fine Arts Department requests to deduct the associated portion of that. If we were to examine the document, the boundary of World Heritage from Sukhothai, Sichatsanalai, and Gampang Phet, the historical town, and the three of these towns are seen as connected with the common values and has outstanding cultural values and meets the criteria 1 and 3 is the construction of the city from the King Khunram Khamhaeng. And we have invited Ajahn Nit Chin Chiranan from the Urban Planning Department. She is greatly experienced in actually interpreting the aerial map. And there is one ancient city that has been recognized as ancient city. And Ajahn Nit We have also used her knowledge as a basis to include that in our nomination paper. And we have also conducted international seminars for over 10 years and building that international cooperation mechanism. And Ayutthaya itself, there is only 229 hectares that has been inscribed as World Heritage. Ayutthaya actually 229 hectares, much less than historical town of Sukhothai. All in all, 1,000 hectares. So being inscribed as World Heritage of Ayutthaya has been problematic. The actual area itself is more than historic city. And to prove the authenticity and integrity, there are physical evidence in terms of palace that has been burned down and temples, which are royal temples. So there are limitations since the beginning, and we have discussed expanding the boundary for a long time. The 229 hectares of Ayutthaya that has been in this prescribed as core property area of World Heritage is very small area. And also basing on the third criteria, because it does not fit in the first criteria. We were discussing the city plan, the moats, canals, and urban morphology of Ayutthaya, but there were no evidence. The area that was inscribed did not discuss these other important components: roads, moats, canals, referencing foreign maps. Ayutthaya is actually of advantage because it's well known to the foreign world. Sukhothai is like, prehistoric city, based in the Ramkhamhaeng and with religious connections with China. And there was no presence of European visitors yet. But Ayutthaya is well known because it's a port city, an international port city, and everyone has mentioned this. But we did not include the evidence as an international port city within that area of World Heritage. We were just focusing the city, the inner city, the main inner city of the king. So this is actually very relevant to the conscience, or the cultural conscience of Thai people, but it's not really robust in its OUV. So that's one of the challenges. And it's problematic. And we did not spend so much time working with communities. That's why it's leading to a lot of problems in management. The second point is currently now Kun Han, the chief of cultural unit, said that it's 30th year of the recommendation of Unesco on the historic landscape, or how. I think tomorrow or today, Kun Montara will mention this. So this is actually a tool that we can actually use. So I'd like to share my personal experience here. So when I work in the documentary team and working with Tan Pongpon Abireksan for 10 years, so I have seen World Heritage sites in other countries. like 60 World Heritage sites in the period of 8 to 10 years that I work in producing the documentary. So one of the examples that I can give is the Troy city, as you've seen in the movie Helen of Troy. The Troy is actually a dream city for these treasure hunters, and the city wanted to excavate and find all the treasures. And in terms of archaeology, archaeologists has declared that this city cannot be studied in archaeological manner as well anymore. But just recently, many archaeologists came together utilizing this new scanning technology to see levels of grounds and found that there's about 7 areas of Troy that has been buried down, and that can be excavated. One Ajahn Chris mentioned this morning about the use of technology, because if we destroy the grounds from construction, and there is actually one case in the court right now between Ratchapat University and Faculty of Fine Arts Department. Ajahn Jurit also mentioned the Tung Kak area in Ayutthaya. And there might be rules and regulations, but it's not being enforced. So I sat in the university board with Ajahn Chanwit. I have been trying to communicate that, but they would argue that there needs to be construction of new buildings in the university. So you can see, the different views of the urban development conflicting with conservation. So they were authorized to use this area, so they are entitled to construct new buildings. So the criteria 3 that applies is actually the only criteria applied to Ayutthaya. And some academia was arguing that Ayutthaya met the 3 criteria. However, I argue that it's only criteria 3. This is actually a trace of lost civilization or existing civilization. So it's not exclusively just palaces and temples, but it has to include the city itself. That shows management, transportation, settlement, way of life, and city defense mechanism, and flood management system, moats, canals, water gates. All of this in the document of Ayutthaya during the research period, there was no mentioning of all of this. But this morning, when we had a presentation from the Fine Arts Department, it's only showing minimal excavation and sites. It doesn't really show the significance historically of Ayutthaya as, as its reign as 400 years of the capital city. At that time, Ajahn Chris also mentioned there were different eras during the period of 500 years when before it's proclaimed as a city, and warfare era, and also eras where there has been influence from other cultures. And there was also an era of commerce between China, Persian, and India, and Europe as well. All of these elements were mentioned this morning. Ajahn Sisak, our first keynote, discussed the third criteria. It also includes the traces of the society, literature, language, not just archaeological aspect. So the point is, we have to look at the historicity using the multidisciplinary and intersectoral knowledge to help us in our critical analysis. It's very dangerous to confirm all the evidence with archaeological evidence. We have talked about moats and canals. Can we see what is being currently used as? It's used as for waste disposal. In the archive, every year, the king of Ayutthaya would request, to drain the sewage because due to annual flood, we never talk about the urban morphology in the city itself. It's in different dimensions.
So thank you so much, Ajahn Savitri. That was very useful, and it allows us to understand actually Ayutthaya had a really even longer name, which also reflects the very nature of its historical city, and also you can understand that the boundaries also were much wider. And next I would like to invite Ajahn Vanopad. So actually after Ayutthaya became the World Heritage Site, what do you believe should be the elements in which Ayutthaya should be protected, and what are the other elements that we should consider? So I've been working with the Fine Arts Department since the very beginning, probably even before Ayutthaya was even in the inventory list of the World Heritage Site by UNESCO. So one of the early progress was just the preparation on making sure that actually Ayutthaya is ready to be a World Heritage Site. And I think in around 1989, it was the first time we looked at the urban mapping, and the criteria has been divided, and also the mapping was divided inside the Ayutthaya Island and outside the walls of the ancient city. And from my learnings, we had know that actually the boundaries also covers both inside the island and also outside. Ayutthaya is special. It's a very significant city and very special, in which Ajahn Chris had mentioned that actually more than 500 years, if actually we conduct further studies, it may be even older than that. It may be 6 centuries, 7 centuries old. And another important thing is we need to inform the relevant agencies and the general population living in the area that the people in Ayutthaya, we still need to conduct more studies. It is not yet enough. We cannot stop. So everything you see, the beautiful ruins, the monuments, and so on, and I still see that there are new discoveries, there are still new findings. And I believe that a lot of people, even those who are the agencies in the area, and basically, simply put, if you look into the heart of it, they had already completed the work, the public works. But actually, what they don't understand, that actually there's a lot of things that they need to conserve. There's more works that needs to be done. There are more interventions needed. So those areas that can be considered important, I think we have a lot of new and a lot of more stuff to learn more, especially underground. And I'm not even sure how many percent was cleared, how many percentage of all the archaeological sites were discovered, because those are still underground. If you want to cover 100% of that, actually in every meter, every square meter, there is something to find, right? I mean, can you imagine? It's 400, 500 years. The amount of the artifacts, the amount of monuments underground, it's significant. Also in the moat, also in the canal, there's so many stuff that we can learn. So those at the riverbeds and also those underwater, these are all significant. So all of these ruins, all of these pieces, they also form an important narrative. There's many other stories, there's many other things and evidence that we need to know. And the question was, what are the things the public needs to know? The first answer is actually the excavation and archaeological discoveries in Ayutthaya is far from complete. And a lot of things that we had found so far are buildings and constructions, and it's not even complete yet. And how long do we have to continue this? Probably many more decades to come, right? And in the progress, it's not just about budget. It's not like you add in this budget, you add in this financial allocation, it'll be done within 5 years, 10 years. So there are many more criteria that's needed for them. For example, we might need to use new technologies, we might need to use new assessment, the current techniques, the current technologies. Once you dig down, maybe it disturbs the site and you only get partial data, so you don't get the complete data. But anyhow, that still continues because we need to get maybe 100% data, or maybe as much as possible, if not 100. But anyway, doing that, the site has already been disturbed, right? There's already been a disturbance in the ruins itself. And so this is one of the key things that we have to make sure that we raise awareness amongst the relevant agencies and also the general public who live in the surrounding communities, so they understand more about conservation work. And for the new discoveries, whether the new information that we had learned today, whether from Ajahn Chris, Ajahn Sisak, Ajahn Dongpikan, and many other panelists who were part of us today, we can see that Ayutthaya, within the context of the Ayutthaya city, Ayutthaya kingdom, it's wide, especially along the waters. Simply put, Chao River from Ayutthaya to the Chao Delta, how long have it been used? At least 700 years. So if you want to think about that, the kingdom actually, it might even reach to where it meets the ocean, right? So those who were involved in the master plan, they asked, do you want Canal as well? Because that's also another port city. That's also the entry. And so I wasn't sure because it was not clear, right? So because actually cannot. It's outside the boundary of the first master plan, right? So that has been designed in 1987. But however, the more information we found out, we actually learned that actually the boundaries and the areas that we set in that first master plan, it was wide, and the boundary covers the major key attributes, the major key sites. So when you talk about the boundaries and the areas that has not yet been excavated, the areas that's not yet been explored, if you talk about the areas that needs to be completed and completely renovated, actually these areas, right? There are numbers. 1 and 2 are inside the island, Ayutthaya. 3, 4, 5, 6, it's outside, and 7 and up are those areas further out inside the Ayutthaya province itself. So that's been dedicated for the areas under protection inside the master plan. So all of these information allow us to see a more comprehensive picture. And so you can see Bata area, and then it's also outside the city wall. And these information should not be limited only to the academe specialists and experts, but it should raise the awareness, and it should increase the awareness amongst the general population. And we need to be able to identify what are the key points and what are the points that we need to highlight. So what are the universal, outstanding universal value? What are the key points? What are the key attributes? And in regards to how, the question of how do we safeguard, how do we make sure that this is protected? I think that is a very challenging question, and I'm not entirely sure how successful it will be. And I also reflect this back to Kun Montira. You need to be clear, right? You need to identify where they are, and because the Fine Arts Department, as the one who is responsible for the protection, you might need to start from identifying exactly where they are. And once you have documented that, you also need to raise awareness. You need to publicize it as much as possible. Inform the relevant agencies in the area, inform the population in the area. Once they understand the importance of the preservation and also the protection, you also need to give them the next thing, which is, so how do we do that? How do we move forward, right? So construction projects, there are so many projects happening now, high-speed railway, bridges, and you also have, on the east side, we have to admit that in the past, a lot of the works are not as focused compared to the inner city area inside Ayutthaya Island. So therefore, these areas are still really important as well. So we need to integrate the different works. We need to integrate different areas of conservation work. Did we had any kind of restoration work before, integration works before? Well, yes, but it can still be improved. So the question is, how do we make sure the integration fulfills and also covers in the most efficient way possible all of the new development projects? The inability to enforce existing regulations and laws are one of the biggest limitations. And you can see in a lot of the results and the things that we do not wish to happen. And sometimes when things really happen, and it increases the risk, and it poses challenges to the heritage site. So what I believe should take place is that you need to raise awareness among the general public as much as possible. Integration, you need to start perhaps the Fine Arts Department. You need to be the key focal point in coordinating with the different agencies and also with the different organization, the civil society organization, and general public. So the fine arts department, you really need to take the lead. So I think this is my very short opinion. Thank you. Thank you, Kun Varapat. That was very short indeed. We have about 20 minutes left. I would like to ask two more panelists to give their opinions. อาจารย์ตรงใจ So from your presentation on the Pukhou system, do you think that currently it reflects how significant Ayutthaya is, right? And how do you think it needs to reflect with the water management so that we increase the awareness among the general public? So actually, water management and water system, Ayutthaya is already famous because they always talk about Ayutthaya as the Venice of the East, but that's actually a very kind of like a general population, the mass perception of Ayutthaya. And then the question is, what are the key river? What are the key waterways in Ayutthaya? You know, for example, Klong Mahapram. When I was in school, I don't really hear much about it, except you know, if the fine arts department or those agencies who are responsible for raising awareness, I think one of the key waterways is Klong Mahapram. So this is one of the key klong that you can also increase awareness. And just to point out that in the past, Ayutthaya used water as the main transportation route, right? So this links to awareness raising that actually now Ayutthaya faces a lot of flood issue. Is it because that we don't know how to manage the water and we don't know how to reference in nature? So perhaps Ayutthaya selected this area and they never faced, and maybe they did, they don't face as much problem with flood as we all do now in this modern days. Maybe they do, but mostly in the archives we find that actually they have issues of drought. So what we need to raise awareness in the issue is Ayutthaya population knew how to adapt to the changing nature. And so how do we make sure there's the flow, there's the water flow, and each of the canal, the modes, they don't get stuck. So that's the first thing we need to do for flood management. And most importantly, number one, it should be the environment. When you want to renovate, you want to renovate the landscapes, then the whole area, you know, the local agencies, the local organizations need to be part of it. If you want to create Ayutthaya as a green city, that could be the highlight, and that could be one of the key emphasis, right? That actually national park, historical park can be as one. This would be very different than Sukhothai, because Sukhothai and Sisachanalai, they're really quite nature, right? They're right in the middle of nature. It's really green. So Ayutthaya, you can also highlight it. You know, now we use it as the urban monument, like urban ruins inside the urban area, and so therefore the issue of environment becomes a bit problematic. So I think the key thing is integration. When you talk about integration, it's there. And the main point, you need to integrate environment. Because from my side, the question is, how do you make sure the historical park, the urban element, and the environment can coexist and coincide? Because when I go to some city, when you pass the city, sometimes you see so many trash and it's really loud, it's really noisy, there's so much pollution, and then at another point, then okay, there's a historical park, and then suddenly there's this car, you know, that emits so much carbon dioxide, and then you see this like really, it is such a contrast. So it's kind of like you're in this area in this city that suddenly happens to have historical parks. So how do you do that? I don't have an experience. I've never been to Japan, but what I've heard is the Japanese really knows how to manage very well. How do you combine nature, urban setting, and so on? And I think they do a very good job. So it's COVID, otherwise I would be there. But so historical park you can look at the different models the different country uses. So maybe you need some kind of progress and you need community participation as well. So I think that's the key point. You need to work with those who are living in the area, right? And quality of life and making sure that the historical park can also coexist in the urban setting. Expanding, I agree very much. So it's about managing, it's about making sure that people in the area can also live as well. They can also be there as well with the conservation. And when I was talking to those who are working in the fine arts department or at Silpakorn University, you can see that the newer archaeologists, they try to work with the community and you see a lot of success. So that's really the key. How do you create that conscience? How do you raise that awareness in the community? And another thing is studying, using at least 2 sites, like Dr. Payal started. So Patapujam and also the east of Ayutthaya. So these information, okay, so it's about analyzing aerial photography and looking at the actual ruins. But what is still missing is still having the right research questions and having the hypothesis and then actually reaffirm and affirm those assumptions. And most importantly, those who are living there also needs to be on the same page. So those who are living there needs to also be on the same level of awareness, and they also need to be part of it, especially in terms of heritage management. So I think that's my quick answer. Thank you. Yes, actually, Jan Tongzai, you also talk about coexistence and also living in harmony between the community and also heritage and also the environment, right? And so another interesting thing is how do you increase the awareness to make sure you see the governance and also like, for example, Klong Mahaplam. A lot of people they are not that aware about the waterways. So people know this like famous phrase saying like Ayutthaya is the Venice of the East. But what about like the waterways that actually are networks of waters that leads to the rest of the nation? I mean, it connects to the rest of the country. So the question is, how do you make sure that people are more literate about this set of knowledge? And so this links to the greatness of the island, right? So I mean, the island itself, it's significant in the sense that actually you have also the different elements, the trade, transportation, commerce, and this also links to the greatness of the city. And to the last part, Ajahn Suitpong, please, if you have any thing to add, because I know you yes. I'm just gonna be very quick because the time is running out. If you ask me what should be the next strategy for Ayutthaya, whether it's for management or what other topics, in order to be the World Heritage Site, you need to be able to link it to the context of those who are residing around the world. So you can see that it is still missing, right? So the original project, so the foreign communities, the international communities, like for me, for example, as a foreigner, when I travel to other cities in the world, I want to see where my ancestors lived. So whether it's China in Naikai or whether it's Persians who are residing near Lachapat University or the Portuguese or the Dutch or even like the Lana inside Ayutthaya, none of this is included in the context of Ayutthaya. So we need this linkage. How do you link international community with Ayutthaya? And the majority of the time we look at, things that are the historical monuments and so on, and the temples, but you cannot compare it to Sukhothai because Sukhothai was an abandoned city. It's a complete ruin. So it's really easy to excavate and restore, right? But Ayutthaya is not such.
แผนการต่อไปถ้าผมมองในโปรเจกต์
And so the next step for the next projects, I think that we really need to pull in international experts. We need to maybe perhaps we invite some experts in the Persian studies and they actually look into, okay, these are the existing communities that might be the Muslim communities that in 16th, 17th century, that in the Western European academe, they say it's grand, it's huge. So what do they actually look like here? Or looking at the Chinese community night guys. So I'm watching this soap opera, this this series, and it asks about what actually does the old brothel look like. Ayutthaya is no longer living. It's a dead corpse of something. And so when you look at this, and then if you have the visuals and you can show it to people, then they understand how international Ayutthaya is. And then also international researchers, the academe, when they actually look at that, they see the Chinese element, they see the Persian element, the Indian element, and the different things. So this was not included, right? We always think about, being Thai or being like Ayutthaya. And that's why Ayutthaya disconnects so much with the international element, because in itself it's very international, right? So this is something that I would like to add as a historical student, a student of history. And I always walk around India since I was young. This is what is missing. So next question is, how do you link the international element and you also increase awareness of people there? Like the people who are in the Muslim community, they know that their area is old, but they don't really collaborate. So the question is, how do you make sure that they can link to the other Muslim countries and be part of it? So that's something I want to see in the next projects if you want to further develop Ayutthaya. Thank you very much. And thank you all the panelists. So from this session and throughout the whole morning sessions, I think that we would understand better the context of Ayutthaya, and it would be more international, because Ayutthaya is actually a metropolitan city. It's not just a historical city, but it's a metropolitan city. And from what everybody has been saying, you can understand that Ayutthaya not only have roots from the past, but actually there's a lot of continuous growth. It does not stop growing. Ayutthaya still have dynamics, despite the fact that it is not the center of government and of governance since the Ayutthaya Lasatani period, but it still has a lot of significance, especially in socio-economic and the cultural elements. As you can see surrounding the waters, you can see industrial complex growing, and you can see that the population still live there because it's not so far from Bangkok. You can see Ayutthaya is still has a lot of dynamics, but still at the same time it's also the World Heritage Site. So actually for Ayutthaya, for all Thais, Ayutthaya is the pride. Ayutthaya is our pride. And when you listen to all of the panelists and the participants and their questions, you can see that everybody is proud of Ayutthaya. And actually in the past 2 and 3 years, there has been a trend from the series Love Destination Bupphe Sanniwad. And it makes people crave that Ayutthaya experience. And that series is not limited only to Thailand, it's been broadcasting in China and in other countries. So, we have tourists coming into Ayutthaya to follow that series. So now we have to rethink, as a cultural site, a heritage site, World Heritage Site, how can Ayutthaya still exist in the time that we still need to do safeguarding, conservation, and also the population also still need to grow, and their quality of life also need to grow. So tomorrow we are going to touch upon the different challenges. And so for the topic of today's sessions, when we talk about values, challenges, and holistic management. So today we talked about values. Tomorrow we're going to talk about challenges and impact. The relevant agencies and researchers will be giving us more information tomorrow. And today, a lot of people discussed about the master plan and so on. And tomorrow, we would have relevant agencies talking about the different plans that are closely linked to the management of Ayutthaya. And then there will be case studies of different countries or other areas. So tomorrow we will see more information, despite the fact that Ajahn Pongchai, you haven't been to Japan. We'll bring Japan to you tomorrow. And we might even go to the UK. We're going to see Stonehenge. And then we're going to see the next episode of Bupphe Sannivat. Kun Kanyavi Somprida would also exchange her experience that she brings the body of knowledge of Ayutthaya in writing her literature and her scripts, and how it became the novel of the century. So before ending today, I would like to inform you tomorrow's agenda. We start at the same time. We start at 9. So the webinar would open around 8:45 to 8:50. The panelists, you're welcome to join since 8. And as the representative from the organizer, I have to say sorry to everyone that we had some challenges with Facebook Live, but that has been fixed. So tomorrow you can watch through the Facebook page of Silapakon in Thai and also SPAFA in English. And those who are lucky, those participants who participated in the lucky draw and those who will receive the gifts from SPAFA will reach out to you and will ask for your address details. Thank you so much for today, and I'll see you again tomorrow at 9. Goodbye.